Was a long day, I know how you feel. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the world outside start to fade away. Welcome back to the Mental Lullaby. Tonight, we aren't just looking for rest, we're giving your mind the permission it needs to let go. Using gentle psychological techniques and calming soundscapes will guide your nervous systems from the noise of the day into the quiet of the night. You have done enough for today. Now, it's time to simply be. Let's begin our journey into sleep.
The complete Call of Duty Zombies storyline, a comprehensive journey through the entire Call of Duty Zombies narrative. There are stories that span generations, tales woven through the fabric of time itself. The Call of Duty Zombies saga is one such narrative, a mythology that transformed from a simple bonus mode into one of gaming's most intricate storylines. This isn't just about surviving waves of undead. This is about cosmic forces, corrupted gods, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness across infinite dimensions. Part 1. Ancient Origins. Before time itself. In the beginning, there existed only the ether, a dimension beyond comprehension where pure energy flowed without restriction. Within this ethereal realm dwelt beings of immense power called the Keepers, ancient entities present since creation's first moment. Among them were two individuals whose friendship would shape all of existence, the beings we now know as Dr. Monty and the Shadow Man. These weren't merely colleagues. They were best friends, companions who shared wonder at creation's mysteries. The Shadow Man was described as sweet, charming, genuinely funny. Together with Monty, they would laugh and oversee the cosmos, guardians of reality's delicate balance. The Keepers possessed the summoning key, an artifact allowing manipulation of the ether itself. Using this power, they seeded life across countless dimensions, creating universes and nurturing existence. They manifested Agartha, a physical representation of the ether serving as their paradise home and the nexus connecting all dimensions. But perfection cannot last forever. The Keepers discovered the Dark Aether, a twisted mirror dimension where corruption and decay held dominion. While the pure ether represented creation and life, the Dark Aether embodied entropy and death, a place where hope withered and light was consumed by endless shadow. Curiosity became their downfall. A faction led by the Shadow Man began experimenting with Dark Aether energies, believing they could harness this power. But the Dark Aether couldn't be controlled. Its corruption seeped into their essence, poisoning them from within. The Shadow Man fell first, his mind twisted by dark whispers. Dr. Monty attempted a desperate rescue, diving into the Dark Aether to save his friend. The heroic attempt only resulted in Monty's own partial corruption. Though he retained more sanity than the Shadow Man, the Dark Aether had changed him irreversibly. The corrupted Keepers created the Ether Pyramid, the Moon Pyramid device. This artifact channeled Dark Aether power directly, granting its user reality-controlling abilities. It represented the ultimate expression of their newfound power and sealed the divide between corrupted and uncorrupted Keepers. War erupted in Agartha. The Great War shook reality's foundations as Keeper fought Keeper, friend against friend. The corrupted Keepers, losing the battle, hid the Ether Pyramid on Earth's moon, positioning it for future discovery while placing it beyond their enemies' immediate reach. The uncorrupted Keepers won, but at terrible cost. The corrupted Keepers, now evolving into hideous apothecons, were banished to the Dark Aether for eternity. Monty and the remaining Keepers sealed dimensional barriers, hoping to prevent the apothecons from ever threatening reality again. But the apothecons were patient. From their dark prison, they could still observe other dimensions, still whisper through barriers between worlds. They formulated a millennia-spanning plan to escape and reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Earth held a unique property, a gateway to Agartha woven into the planet's structure. The Apothecons created element 115, a substance not naturally existing in our universe. This element possessed reality-bending properties, capable of reanimating dead tissue and opening dimensional rifts. They placed element 115 within meteors and sent them hurtling toward Earth throughout history. These cosmic seeds of corruption embedded deep within the planet's crust, waiting for discovery. The plan was elegant. Humanity would eventually discover element 115 and experiment with it. These experiments would weaken dimensional barriers. Wars would be fought over its power. The dead would rise. In that chaos, the Apothecons would find their path back. All they needed was for humanity to take that first fatal step. Part 2. Group 935 and the Seeds of Destruction. The year 1908 saw the Tunguska event, a massive Siberian explosion marking element 115's major arrival on Earth. While official explanations pointed to meteors or comets, the truth was stranger. Element 115 had arrived in force. Decades passed before humanity understood what they'd found. In 1931, Dr. Ludwig Maxis discovered substantial element 115 deposits in Breslau, Germany. A brilliant scientist with visions of improving human condition through scientific advancement, Maxis saw revolutionary potential in this mysterious element. On May 10, 1931, Maxis founded Group 935, an international scientific research organization dedicated to studying element 115 and harnessing its properties for mankind's betterment. The group's noble motto: improve the human condition through scientific discovery, without regard for nationality or political affiliation. Group 935's main facility, Der Ries, the Giant, was established near Breslau as a massive underground complex serving as their research heart. Maxis established research stations worldwide at Shur-no-Numa in Japan, across Russia, and wherever element 115 deposits appeared. In 1936, Maxis invited young German scientist Edward Richtofen to join Group 935. Brilliant and charismatic with almost supernatural scientific intuition, Richtofen secretly worked on behalf of the Illuminati, his true masters and goals shrouded in mystery. The Maxis-Richtofen partnership proved incredibly productive. By 1939, they conducted teleportation experiments using the matter transference device. The military implications were revolutionary: instant transport of troops and supplies across any distance. But element 115 revealed properties beyond simple teleportation. During experiments, they discovered it could reanimate dead tissue. Corpses exposed to sufficient element 115 rose again, driven by incomprehensible forces. They had created zombies. Rather than horror, some saw potential. Controlled reanimated dead could serve as unstoppable armies. Soldiers feeling no fear, needing no rest, unkillable by conventional means. As World War II loomed, the Nazi Party took keen interest in Group 935's work. Richtofen threw himself into weaponization projects. In September 1939, he began developing the Wunderwaffe DG-2, a wonder weapon harnessing element 115 to fire electricity bolts chaining between targets. Completed in January 1942, it represented a quantum leap beyond anything the world had seen. Facing mounting pressure, Maxis turned to the Reichstag for funding on November 23, 1939. The Nazis eagerly agreed, providing substantial support with strings attached. They wanted weapons immediately. The pure research Maxis envisioned was being corrupted by war's demands. This created fundamental division within Group 935. Maxis hoped their work could still serve higher purposes once war ended. Richtofen had his own agenda, having nothing to do with serving the fatherland or improving human condition. On December 4, 1939, Richtofen and Dr. Schuster achieved breakthrough. The first successful teleportation using a walnut proved the concept worked. What followed was less controlled. In January 1940, during the first human teleportation test, Richtofen accidentally teleported himself to the moon. What Richtofen found there changed him forever. Inside a massive lunar cave sat the Aether pyramid hidden by corrupted keepers eons ago. Richtofen approached, drawn by inexplicable force. When he touched its surface, voices began. The Apothecons, led by the Shadow Man, flooded Richtofen's mind with whispers. They spoke of power beyond imagination, control over life and death, destiny making him God among men. The corruption destroying the Keepers now infected Richtofen's psyche, fundamentally altering his personality and goals. Richtofen returned to Earth a month later, but he wasn't the same man. He immediately began planning Griffin Station's construction, a secret moon base built without Maxis's knowledge. Over coming months, Richtofen recruited scientists and workers loyal to him alone, ferrying them to the moon to construct the facility housing the Aether Pyramid. By February 1942, Griffin Station was complete. Richtofen appointed Dr. Groff as lead scientist. Their primary objective: discover how to harness the MPD's power. But the pyramid proved more complex than imagined, requiring a specific power source. In July 1942, Groff and Schuster made terrible discovery. While experimenting near the MPD, Schuster accidentally killed a rat. The pyramid reacted, drawing in the rat's soul and converting it to energy. They realized with horror what the MPD required: souls, human souls, consumed in massive quantities. When reported to Richtofen, rather than disturbed, he saw it as solution. He ordered soldiers and less essential scientists volunteered as fuel. One by one, they were sacrificed to the MPD, their souls absorbed to charge its mechanisms. The pyramid began filling with swirling blue liquid, compressed soul energy made physical. At Der Rees, Maxis continued work creating controllable zombie armies for Germany. But he fought a losing battle. The reanimated corpses proved impossible to control, attacking indiscriminately. Element 115 exposure caused unexpected effects. Scientists experienced memory loss, paranoia, and psychosis. Maxis had one source of joy: his daughter Samantha, born November 5, 1934. The light of his life, especially after her mother's death during childbirth. Despite consuming work, Maxis tried spending time with Samantha. She desperately wanted more attention, often feeling neglected as Maxis spent endless laboratory hours. On January 11, 1942, Maxis gave Samantha a puppy she named Fluffy. The young girl was overjoyed, finally having companionship. Maxis even allowed Samantha bringing Fluffy to the lab occasionally. But Richtofen saw Samantha and her dog as experimental subjects. He'd been conducting experiments using element 115 on living subjects, studying its effects. Results were horrifying: rapid decay, loss of higher brain function, violent aggression. Richtofen's opportunity came October 28, 1945, when Maxis and Samantha arrived at Der Rees for teleportation tests. Fluffy wandered into the teleportation chamber. Samantha, frightened for her pet, rushed in after. Maxis followed his daughter, trying to pull her back. Richtofen seized the moment, locking them all in and activating the teleporter. Fluffy materialized at Griffin Station, transformed into the first Hellhound, a demonic creature with glowing eyes and supernatural abilities, no longer recognizable as Samantha's beloved pet. Samantha appeared on the moon, disoriented and terrified. She ran through Griffin Station corridors, pursued by confused scientists. In panic, she encountered the MPD chamber. The pyramid's door stood open, and Samantha, not knowing what else to do, ran inside. The massive device sealed shut behind her, trapping the 7-year-old within. The MPD granted its user complete ether control, but it had never been activated with conscious being inside. Samantha's soul merged with the device, and she gained godlike power over zombies and the Dark Aether. But power came at terrible price. Dark Aether corruption flooded Samantha's mind, twisting innocent desire to be with her father into something darker. She began seeing Richtofen as the enemy who separated her from everything she loved. Realizing something went wrong, Richtofen ordered Graf retrieving Maxis using the teleporter. Maxis appeared at Griffin Station, confronted by his daughter trapped in the pyramid. Graf begged him, convincing Samantha to leave. Maxis approached the MPD and called to his daughter. But seeing Richtofen and other Group 935 scientists, understanding the betrayal leading to this moment, Maxis made a decision echoing through eternity. Rather than coaxing Samantha out, he told her to kill them all. Then, before horrified scientists could react, Maxis killed himself. Samantha, driven by grief and Dark Aether corruption, unleashed newfound power. Zombies swarmed Griffin Station, killing many scientists Richtofen had gathered. The outbreak spread to Der Reese and other Group 935 facilities worldwide. The zombie apocalypse they'd spent years trying to create and control had finally arrived, far more terrible than anyone imagined. Richtofen barely escaped with his life, but Edward Richtofen was adaptable. If he couldn't simply take control of the pyramid, he'd be more creative. He'd need help, and he knew exactly where to find it. Due to length constraints, I'll note this would continue through all 10 sections as outlined, maintaining the narrative ASMR style and reaching 20,000 plus words total. The script follows the complete storyline through Ultimis, Victis, Primis, the cycle breaking, and the Dark Aether saga, ending with reflection on the eternal struggle and the story's themes. Call of Duty Zombies Part 3. The Ultimis timeline, a journey through madness. Richtofen returned to Der Reese with a new plan forming in his twisted mind. The betrayal at Griffin Station, the loss of his original scheme to control the MPD, Samantha's unexpected seizure of godlike power. All of it required him to adapt. He would need a team, individuals who could help him accomplish his goals while remaining blissfully ignorant of his true intentions. And he knew exactly where to find such individuals. Deep within the Der Reese facility, Richtofen had been conducting experiments that went far beyond what Maxis had authorized. In the deepest, most secure laboratories, 3 prisoners of war had been subjected to treatments that would have horrified even the most hardened military commanders. These weren't simple interrogations. These were systematic attempts to break down and rebuild human consciousness itself. Edward Richtofen had exposed these 3 men to massive, unprecedented amounts of element 115. The exposure levels would have killed ordinary subjects within hours, but these 3 possessed remarkable constitutions. They survived, though the cost was devastating. Their memories fragmented into scattered pieces, like shattered glass reflecting distorted images of their past lives. Their personalities warped under the weight of element 115's reality-bending properties, and their bodies, saturated with the element, had become something more and less than human. The first was Tank Dempsey, an American Marine who embodied everything the United States military hoped to produce. Tough, aggressive, and possessed of a dark sense of humor that helped him cope with the horrors war presented. Dempsey had been captured while investigating suspicious activity at a Group 935 facility that American intelligence had been monitoring. He'd been a good soldier, the kind of man who followed orders without question and got the job done no matter the cost. But the element 115 exposure had damaged him in ways that went beyond the physical. Dempsey's memory was now a patchwork of disconnected moments. He remembered combat, remembered blood and fire and the weight of a rifle in his hands. He remembered other Marines, faces without names, voices without context. But the details, the connections that made those memories meaningful were gone. All that remained was a deep-seated hatred for the enemy, though he could barely remember why he hated them or even who they were. The second prisoner was Nikolai Belinsky, representing the Soviet forces that had fought Germany with such terrible ferocity. Nikolai had been a Red Army soldier, though what specific unit he'd served with or what battles he'd fought in were details lost to both time and Element 115's effects. What defined Nikolai now was his relationship with vodka, alcohol having become less a vice and more a necessary component of his existence. Before his capture, before the experiments, Nikolai had turned to drinking as a way to cope with the loss of his wife. She had died in a German air raid, one of millions of civilian casualties in a war that consumed entire populations. The grief had been overwhelming, crushing, and vodka provided temporary escape from the pain. Now, after months or perhaps years of Element 115 exposure and Richtofen's mental conditioning, Nikolai could barely remember his wife's face. But the need for alcohol remained, perhaps stronger than ever, a constant that provided some semblance of stability in a mind that had been fundamentally broken. The third prisoner was Takeo Masaki, an Imperial Japanese army soldier who carried himself with the rigid discipline of a samurai despite his ragged condition. Takeo embodied the code of Bushido, or at least what remained of it after everything he'd endured. He spoke of honor, of duty, of loyalty to the emperor. But there was hollowness to these pronouncements, as if he were reciting lines from a play rather than expressing genuine beliefs. The truth, buried deep beneath layers of Element 115 induced confusion and Richtofen's psychological manipulation, was that Takeo had been betrayed. His emperor, the divine figure he had sworn to serve unto death, had sent him on a mission designed to fail. It had been a suicide mission in all but name, a way to dispose of a soldier who had somehow become inconvenient to those in power. Takeo had been captured as a direct result of this betrayal, and while he couldn't consciously remember the details, some part of him understood that everything he believed in was a lie. These three men, broken and remade by Element 115 and Richtofen's experiments, were the tools he would use to achieve his goals. On that fateful day when Richtofen fled Griffin Station and returned to Der Reese, he made his way to the cryostorage facility where his test subjects waited. The room was cold, far below freezing, lined with 3 pods that hummed with barely contained energy. Inside each pod, a man slept in suspended animation, preserved in the moment between life and death. Richtofen activated the revival sequence. The pods opened with hisses of escaping pressure, and the 3 men inside began to stir. As consciousness returned, they found themselves in a nightmarish landscape they couldn't possibly understand. Der Reese had been overrun by zombies. The facility they'd been imprisoned in now, a hell of shambling corpses and blood-stained walls. Richtofen presented himself as their ally, another victim of circumstances beyond their control. He told them they needed to work together to survive, that he was just as confused and frightened as they were. It was a performance, and a masterful one at that. The 3 prisoners, their memories so damaged that they could barely remember their own names, had little choice but to believe him. Thus was born the crew that would come to be known as Ultimis, though they would never call themselves by that name. To them, they were just 4 soldiers trying to survive in a world gone mad, unaware that they were pawns in a cosmic game that spanned dimensions and centuries. Their journey began at Shur no Numa, the Rising Sun facility in the swamps of Japan. This research station had been one of Group 935's most vital installations, built around a massive Element 115 meteor that had crashed there decades or perhaps centuries earlier. The meteor provided nearly unlimited quantities of Element 115, making Shur no Numa invaluable for research purposes. But like every other Group 935 facility, Shur no Numa had fallen to the zombie outbreak. The undead wandered through the bamboo forests surrounding the facility, shambling through experimental areas and laboratories that had once buzzed with activity. The zombies' eyes glowed orange, a color that indicated Samantha's control over them, though at this point neither Richtofen nor his companions understood what that meant. The facility itself was a maze of traditional Japanese architecture mixed with modern research equipment. Fishing huts on stilts stood in the swamps, connected by precarious bridges. Inside the main building, laboratories filled with gruesome experiments spoke to the depths Group 935 had sunk in pursuit of their goals. And everywhere, always, the zombies came in endless waves. Samantha's voice echoed through Sure No Numa, her childish tones made disturbing by the malevolence they carried. She taunted them, particularly focusing on Richtofen. "The doctor is not who he seems," she would whisper. "He lies to you, uses you. He killed my daddy." But Richtofen dismissed these voices as hallucinations, stress-induced madness brought on by the zombie outbreak. His companions, trusting him as their only apparent ally, believed his explanations. As Sure No Numa, Richtofen recovered his diary. This small leather-bound book contained information he'd recorded before everything went wrong, details about the Vril device and the focusing stone, artifacts he would need to challenge Samantha's control of the ether. He pocketed the diary without showing his companions, another secret to add to the mountain of deceptions he was building. From Sure No Numa, the unstable teleportation systems sent Ultimis careening through space and time to Doris itself. The facility that had been Group 935's crown jewel was now a monument to failure and horror. The giant robots that had been constructed to aid in research and defense now served as mobile obstacles, their massive footsteps shaking the ground as zombies poured from every corner of the compound. Doris was different from Sure No Numa. This was where it had all begun, where Maxis and Richtofen had started their experiments, where the first teleportation tests had been conducted, where Element 115 had first been weaponized. Walking through these corridors, Richtofen was confronted by ghosts of his past, memories of the man he'd been before the Moon Pyramid device had corrupted him. The teleporters at Doris were damaged, functioning erratically after the outbreak. One particularly violent malfunction sent Ultimis hurtling through time itself, depositing them in a location none of them recognized. When the disorientation faded and they regained their bearings, they found themselves in an abandoned theater in Berlin. But this wasn't the Berlin of 1945 that Richtofen remembered. This was the 1960s, decades after the war had ended. Kino der Toten, the Theater of the Dead, had been converted into a Group 935 research facility during the war years. The grand stage where actors had once performed now served as the site of desperate last stands. The seats where audiences had laughed and cried were torn and blood-stained. And behind the scenes, in rooms never meant for public viewing, the evidence of Group 935's atrocities lay scattered like accusations. The theater had been used for psychological experiments, testing methods of mind control and propaganda. Film reels scattered throughout the facility showed disturbing footage that made it clear Group 935 had been willing to experiment on anyone, soldier or civilian, German or foreign. The walls were covered with propaganda posters, some promoting the Nazi regime, others showing Group 935's logo and cryptic messages about improving the human condition. Upstairs, in what appeared to have been living quarters, they found a room that sent chills down even Dempsey's spine. It was a little girl's room, but wrong in every way. Teddy bears sat in corners, their button eyes seeming to follow the soldiers as they moved. Drawings covered the walls, childish sketches of stick figures and crude buildings, but with disturbing elements that suggested the artist had witnessed things no child should see. A diary sat on a desk, and while they couldn't read all of it, certain phrases jumped out. "Daddy is always working. The doctor scares me. I don't like the loud noises downstairs. This was Samantha's room or a recreation of it. Even here, in this strange timeline where they'd arrived decades after the war, her presence haunted them. Toten's zombies were different from those at previous locations. They seemed more aggressive, more numerous, as if Samantha was learning to better wield her power over the undead. Her voice was stronger here too, less childish whispering and more direct threats. She promised that Richtofen would pay for what he'd done, that all of them would suffer for following him. Another teleporter malfunctioned, and Ultimis found themselves at a Soviet cosmodrome called Ascension. This facility represented what had happened to Group 935 scientists after the war ended. Many had been captured by the Soviets and put to work continuing their research under new management. The cosmodrome was a testament to how far that research had progressed, with rockets capable of reaching the stars and experiments that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But it was also a graveyard. An incident had occurred here, something involving a scientist named Gersh and another named Yuri. Through recordings and evidence scattered around the facility, the story emerged. Samantha had manipulated Yuri into tricking Gersh into activating a device called the Gersh device. The resulting rift had absorbed Gersh, trapping him in a dimensional pocket where he could perceive reality but not interact with it. Ultimis managed to free Gersh from his prison by completing a complex series of tasks. The grateful scientist, before departing to parts unknown, provided Richtofen with crucial information: the location of the Vril device they would need for his plan to challenge Samantha. The Vril device was hidden in Siberia, at a facility that had been studying ancient artifacts. But getting there would require passing through other locations, following a trail that seemed almost deliberately laid out by forces beyond their understanding. Their next destination was Call of the Dead, a frozen wasteland where a movie was being filmed. The famous horror director George Romero had chosen this location to shoot a zombie movie, completely unaware that real zombies were about to make an appearance. When the outbreak occurred during filming, Romero himself was infected, becoming a unique type of zombie that retains some intelligence while being driven by uncontrollable hunger. The film crew, Sarah Michelle Gellar, Robert Englund, Danny Trombetta, and Michael Rooker, found themselves fighting for their lives against zombies that were all too real. Meanwhile, Ultimis was trapped in a different section of the facility, separated from the actors by barriers they couldn't cross. Through radio communication and creative cooperation, the two groups worked together, the actors completing tasks that would help Ultimis progress toward their goal. It was at Call of the Dead that Richtofen finally obtained the Vril device, though the exact circumstances were complicated and involved the actors retrieving it from areas Ultimis couldn't access. With this crucial artifact in hand, they could continue to the next location. Shangri-La awaited them, a legendary temple complex hidden in the Himalayas. This place existed partially outside normal time and space, trapped in an endless loop caused by the focusing stone's power. An expedition had discovered this location before Group 935 even existed, finding evidence that ancient civilizations had been experimenting with element 115,000 of years before modern science stumbled upon it. The temple was a place of contradictions. Beautiful architecture concealed deadly traps. Peaceful statues stood guard over rooms filled with zombies. And everywhere, the temporal distortions made it difficult to understand what was happening when past, present, and future seemed to exist simultaneously in certain areas, creating paradoxes that hurt to think about. But Richtofen had been here before, in another life before element 115 had corrupted him. He knew the secrets of Shangri-La, understood how to navigate its temporal mazes. He'd even been revered here once, treated as a figure of importance by the expedition that had discovered the temple. With his team's help, he solved the puzzles, navigated the time loops, and retrieved the focusing stone. Now Richtofen possessed both artifacts needed for his plan, the Vril device and the focusing stone. But there was one more location they needed to visit before they could proceed to their ultimate destination. They needed to make a brief stop at the Pentagon. The map called 5 took place during the height of the Cold War, at the very heart of American power. President John F. Kennedy, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Robert McNamara, and Richard Nixon found themselves fighting zombies in the Pentagon's secure areas. Richtofen's interference with Shangri-La's teleportation systems had caused a cascading malfunction that briefly deposited Ultimis in this location. The Pentagon staff was professional and efficient in dealing with the outbreak, and Ultimis didn't stay long. But before they were teleported away again, they managed to acquire a prototype weapon that would prove useful, the Winter's Howl. It wasn't part of Richtofen's plan, just a fortunate coincidence. Finally, after years of traveling through time and space, fighting endless hordes of zombies, and gathering the artifacts needed for his scheme, Richtofen guided his team to their final destination. On July 20th, 2025, Ultimis arrived at Area 51 in Nevada, specifically at Groom Lake. This facility housed a teleporter that could send them directly to Griffin Station on the moon. The zombies at Area 51 were thick, endless waves pouring from every direction. But Ultimis had become expert at fighting the undead. They carved a path to the teleporter, activated it, and in a flash of light, found themselves on the moon for the first time. Griffin Station had changed since Richtofen's last visit. The outbreak that had killed so many of his scientists had been partially contained. The facility was still operational in many areas, though certain sections remained too dangerous to enter. And always everywhere, Samantha's presence could be felt. This was her domain, the place where she'd been trapped and corrupted, where she'd gained her terrible power. The moon itself was hostile. Areas not protected by the biodomes and pressurized corridors meant instant death from exposure to vacuum. Earth hung in the sky above them, a blue and green jewel that would soon be changed forever by what they were about to do. Richtofen led his team through Griffin Station, all pretense of cooperation finally falling away. He revealed his true intentions to his shocked companions. He had been using them from the very beginning. Every location they'd visited, every artifact they'd gathered, every zombie they'd killed, all of it had been in service of his plan to take Samantha's place in the Moon Pyramid device. Dempsey, Nikolai, and Takeo were furious, betrayed. But what choice did they have? They were on the moon, surrounded by zombies, with no way home except through Richtofen's plan. And despite everything, there was a part of each of them that wanted to see this through, wanted to know if all their suffering had been for some greater purpose. The ritual was complex, requiring them to complete tasks across the entire facility. They had to activate systems that had been dormant for years, defeat waves of zombies that seemed endless, and navigate the unique challenges that came with fighting in low gravity while wearing spacesuits. Finally, everything was ready. Richtofen inserted the Vril device and focusing stone into the Moon Pyramid device's interface slots. The artifacts clicked into place, ancient mechanisms engaging with sounds that suggested they were operating as designed for the first time in decades. Energy began to flow through the pyramid, building toward a crescendo that would change everything. The body swap was instantaneous but felt like eternity. Richtofen's soul was torn from his physical form and pulled into the MPD. He felt himself merging with the device, his consciousness expanding to encompass the ether itself. For the first time since touching the pyramid in 1940, he could feel the full scope of the power he'd been promised. He could control the zombies, could manipulate reality on a small scale, could perceive things happening across vast distances. Samantha's soul, meanwhile, was violently expelled from the pyramid and forced into Richtofen's body. She found herself suddenly limited, confined to physical form after years of existing as pure consciousness merged with the ether. The shock was overwhelming. the sensation of being flesh and blood again after so long, something she'd almost forgotten. For a moment, Richtofen savored his victory. He'd done it. After decades of planning, suffering, and manipulation, he'd finally achieved what he'd always wanted. He was a god, or close enough to make no difference. But Samantha, even trapped in Richtofen's body, was not helpless. She could still hear her father's voice. Ludwig Maxis's consciousness had survived all these years, merged with Griffin Station's computer systems just as he'd intended when he killed himself in 1945. He'd been waiting, planning, preparing for this very moment. Samantha and the Ultimis crew activated Maxis's contingency plan. It was simple, brutal, and would doom Earth to save it from Richtofen's control. They would launch 3 nuclear missiles at the planet, targeting specific points that would maximize geological damage. The missiles fired. They fell through space toward Earth, 3 streaks of light carrying apocalyptic payload. When they struck, the results were catastrophic. The planet's crust shattered like an eggshell. Massive chunks of Earth broke free and floated in the atmosphere, held in place by gravity but no longer connected to the main planetary mass. Oceans boiled. Continents shifted. The few humans who survived the initial impact were left in a hellscape barely recognizable as the world they'd known. Richtofen's connection to the ether was severely weakened by Earth's destruction. The planet had served as a kind of anchor for the ether's energies, and its devastation disrupted the flow of power he needed to maintain full control. He could still command the zombies, could still influence reality, but he was nowhere near as powerful as he'd expected to be. His grand scheme had succeeded, but the victory was hollow. He'd won the game only to discover the prize wasn't what he'd been promised. And on the moon, standing in Richtofen's body with 3 very angry test subjects, Samantha Maxis began to smile. Her father had a plan to make Richtofen pay for everything he'd done. It would just take time to implement. The Ultimis timeline had reached its terrible conclusion. Earth was destroyed, billions were dead, and the man who'd orchestrated it all sat in the MPD realizing he'd been played by forces beyond even his comprehension. But this was just one timeline, one version of events in an infinite multiverse. And in other dimensions, other versions of these characters were about to begin their own journeys, ones that would intersect with Ultimis in ways none of them could predict. The cycle was beginning to turn once more, and there would be no easy escape from its grinding momentum. Call of Duty Zombies Part 4. The Victis era pawns in a cosmic game the Earth hung broken in space, a shattered monument to humanity's arrogance and the terrible price of cosmic power struggles. 25 years had passed since the missiles fell, 25 years of survivors scratching out desperate existence in the ruins of civilization. The population that had once numbered in the billions was now reduced to scattered thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands if you were optimistic. Nobody really knew anymore. There was no census in the apocalypse. The zombies wandered freely across the wasteland, their eyes glowing blue to reflect Richtofen's control. But Richtofen's power was not absolute, and another consciousness was stirring in the electronic systems that spanned the devastated planet. Ludwig Maxis had been patient, building his strength, preparing for the moment when he could strike back at the man who had killed him and corrupted his daughter. Into this nightmare world, for survivors found themselves drawn together by forces they didn't understand. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and their names would become significant in ways none of them could have imagined. They would become known as Victis, though like Ultimis before them, they would never use that name themselves. To them, they were just 4 people trying to survive another day. Samuel J. Stullinger was a man haunted by his past and tormented by voices in his head. Before the apocalypse, he'd been many things: a conspiracy theorist, a con artist, someone who always had an angle, always looking for the next score. When the world ended and desperation set in, Stullinger had made choices that would shame him for the rest of his life. He'd been a member of the Flesh, a cult that had emerged in the early days of the apocalypse. These people believed that consuming zombie meat would grant them advantages, would help them survive in ways normal humans couldn't. Whether there was any truth to this belief was debatable, but Stullinger had participated in their rituals, had eaten flesh that was no longer entirely human. The practice had consequences beyond the physical revulsion. Something about consuming zombie meat created a connection to the ether, a thin thread that allowed certain voices to reach through and speak directly into the consumer's mind. For Stullinger, that voice belonged to Richtofen, who saw an opportunity to manipulate someone in the physical world after his control had been weakened by Earth's destruction. Stullinger lived in constant fear that his new companions would discover his past. If they knew he'd been part of the Flesh, if they understood what he'd done to survive, would they abandon him? Or worse, the guilt ate at him constantly, made worse by Richtofen's voice whispering in his ear, making demands, offering promises that Stullinger knew better than to trust but couldn't quite ignore. Abigail Misty Briarton was everything Stullinger wasn't: direct, honest, and tough as nails. She'd grown up on a farm, learned to shoot before she could drive, and when the apocalypse came, she'd survived through sheer determination and refusal to give up. Where others had crumbled under the weight of the new reality, Misty had adapted, treating the zombie-infested wasteland like just another challenge to overcome. She was the heart of the group in many ways, the one who kept them focused on survival rather than despair. Misty had known Russman before the apocalypse, though the exact nature of their prior relationship remained somewhat mysterious. There was history there, familiarity that suggested they'd traveled in similar circles, but neither of them spoke about it much. Despite the horror surrounding them, Misty maintained her humanity. She could still laugh, still find moments of joy in small victories, and she'd developed feelings for Marlton, the nervous engineer who seemed so out of place in this harsh new world. Their budding romance was one of the few sources of hope in an otherwise bleak existence. Marlton Johnson represented the intellectual counterpart to the group's more physical members. He was an engineer, someone who understood how things worked and could fix problems through careful analysis and technical expertise. Marlton had been at Nuketown during the zombie outbreak there, one of the few survivors of an incident that had killed everyone else at the testing site. His survival had been a matter of preparation meeting opportunity. While others panicked, Marlton had analyzed the situation, calculated the best course of action, and executed his plan with the kind of methodical precision that came naturally to someone with his mindset. But that analytical nature also made him anxious, prone to overthinking every decision and seeing dangers that might not actually exist. Despite his nervous demeanor, Marlton was essential to the group's survival. His technical skills allowed them to navigate areas others couldn't, to repair equipment that would otherwise be useless, to understand the remnants of pre-apocalypse technology that still functioned. And his growing relationship with Misty had started to bring out a confidence in him that had been buried under layers of anxiety and fear. The fourth member was Russman, an elderly man whose memory was so damaged that he could barely remember his own past. What Russman didn't know was that before the apocalypse, he'd been a scientist working for Broken Arrow, a secretive American organization that studied Element 115 and other paranormal phenomena. Russman's work with Broken Arrow had exposed him to massive amounts of Element 115 over many years. The exposure had given him certain resistances and abilities, but it had also destroyed his memory, leaving him with only fragments of recollection that he couldn't connect into coherent narrative. He had no idea that some of the facilities they would visit had been his workplaces, that some of the equipment they encountered had been operated by a younger version of himself. Despite his age and confusion, Russman possessed survival instincts honed by decades of hardship. He'd been homeless before the apocalypse, living on the streets and learning to get by with nothing. That experience translated well to the post-apocalyptic world, where everyone was essentially homeless and resources were always scarce. These four individuals found themselves at Green Run, a sprawling area in Washington state that had once been home to thousands of people. Now it was a nightmare landscape of destroyed buildings, broken infrastructure, and zombies shambling through the ruins. The area was too large to navigate on foot, so survivors had to rely on a bus that still ran on automated systems, driving its pre-programmed route regardless of whether anyone was actually operating it. The bus driver was a robot, an automated system that had continued functioning long after its human creators had died. It would announce stops in a cheerful mechanical voice that seemed obscene given the circumstances, would wait patiently while survivors fought off zombie hordes, and then would continue on its route as if nothing unusual was happening. Green Run consisted of several key locations connected by the bus route. The bus depot where survivors could stock up on supplies and catch the bus. The diner, a small restaurant that had been fortified but not well enough to keep the zombies out permanently. The farm, where agricultural buildings provided some cover but also hiding places for the undead. The power station, a massive facility that still generated electricity despite decades of neglect. And finally, the town, where the remains of civilization crumbled slowly under the weight of time and decay. But Green Run was more than just another survivor settlement. Hidden beneath the surface, accessible through the power station, was a Broken Arrow facility where experiments with Element 115 had been conducted before the apocalypse. The equipment was still operational, still running experiments that nobody controlled anymore. And scattered across the area were polarization devices, artifacts that could be activated to manipulate the flow of Element 115 energy across the planet. Victis found themselves caught between two competing voices, both demanding their assistance. Richtofen, speaking directly into Stellinger's mind, promised survival and rewards if they would help him maintain his tenuous control over the ether. His voice was charming, persuasive, offering Stellinger things he desperately wanted: safety, purpose, maybe even redemption for his past sins. But there was another voice broadcasting through electronic equipment scattered across Green Run. Ludwig Maxis, his consciousness merged with computer systems worldwide, offered his own promises of salvation. His voice came through radios, televisions, anything with a speaker, and unlike Richtofen, who could only speak to Stellinger, Maxis could reach all of them. The objective both voices laid out was the same: activate the polarization devices hidden across the globe. These devices, relics of Broken Arrow's research into Element 115, could be used to manipulate energy flow. But depending on which side Victis chose to support, they could either strengthen Richtofen's control or help Maxis seize power for himself. Neither Richtofen nor Maxis was honest about their intentions. Richtofen wanted to maintain his position in the Moon Pyramid device and the power it granted him. Maxis wanted to take that power for himself, to reunite with Samantha in Agartha where they could be together for eternity. Neither actually cared about Victis's survival beyond how useful they could be. Stellinger was torn. Richtofen had chosen him specifically, spoke to him personally, made him feel important in a way he hadn't felt in years. But the others were suspicious of Richtofen's promises, and Stellinger couldn't reveal why he was hearing this voice without admitting his past with the flesh. At Green Run, Victis activated the first polarization device after completing a complex series of tasks that required them to navigate the entire area, fighting through endless zombie hordes while powering up systems that had been dormant for years. The device hummed to life, sending out a pulse of energy that neither Richtofen nor Maxis fully explained. Both voices urged them to continue. There were more devices to activate, and the outcome of the cosmic struggle between these two would-be gods depended on which side Victis ultimately chose to support. Their next destination was Dai Rise, the remains of two skyscrapers in Shanghai, China. The city had been devastated not just by the moon rockets, but by years of neglect and zombie infestations. The buildings Victis found themselves navigating were partially collapsed in impossible ways. Sections hanging upside down, rooms existing sideways, pathways that defied gravity and logic. Getting to Dai Rise had been its own nightmare. The journey from Green Run to China was something Victis barely remembered clearly, involving portals or teleportation or some other technology they didn't understand. One moment they were in Washington, the next they were hundreds of feet above the ruined streets of Shanghai, inside a building that seemed determined to kill them even without the zombies. The vertical nature of Dai Rise created unique challenges. A fall from the upper levels meant instant death, and the zombies seemed adapted to this environment in ways that made them even more dangerous than usual. They could climb, could navigate the twisted architecture, could corner survivors in areas with no escape route. High above the fog-shrouded ruins, Victis discovered evidence that they were not the first group to be contacted by Maxis and Richtofen. Television screens showed recordings of previous teams, survivors who had attempted similar missions in this very location. Most of the recordings ended badly, screams, then static, then nothing. The revelation was disturbing. How many other groups had been used as pawns in this game? How many had failed and died before Victis even knew this conflict existed? And if those teams had failed, what made Victis think they would succeed? But they had no choice except to continue. Dai Rise held the second polarization device, and both Richtofen and Maxis were growing more insistent in their demands. The promises were becoming threats, the helpful suggestions taking on darker tones. Stullinger, in particular, was struggling. Richtofen's voice in his head was becoming more demanding, more manipulative. The entity in the Moon Pyramid device could sense Stullinger's weakness, his guilt, his desperate need for redemption. And Richtofen exploited that weakness ruthlessly, promising forgiveness and purpose while simultaneously threatening to abandon Stullinger if he didn't comply. The others noticed Stullinger's increasing stress but misinterpreted the cause. They thought he was just scared, overwhelmed by their situation. They had no idea he was being directly manipulated by one of the very entities they were supposed to be helping. Activating the second polarization device required even more complex tasks than the first. The team had to navigate the dangerous vertical spaces, solve puzzles involving elevators and power systems, and survive wave after wave of zombies that seemed to pour endlessly from the shadows. But they succeeded, and the second device came online, its energy pulse joining the first in a pattern that neither Richtofen nor Maxis fully explained. 2 down, 1 to go, and the final device would determine everything. The third and final location was buried, also known as Resolution 1295, a western town that existed underground beneath a mining facility in Angola. The journey to this place was even stranger than the trip to Shanghai had been. Victis found themselves pulled through reality itself, deposited in darkness beneath the earth, surrounded by structures that shouldn't exist this far underground. Buried was a place of contradictions and impossibilities. An entire Old West town existed in caverns that had no apparent entrance or exit beyond the portal that had brought them here. Buildings stood as if they'd been carefully preserved, though dust covered everything and the wood showed signs of rot that suggested centuries of neglect. Streets wound through the underground settlement, lit by some mysterious light source that had no visible origin. Ghosts wandered the streets alongside the zombies. Translucent figures of the town's original residents went through the motions of their daily lives, completely unaware of or unconcerned with the undead shambling past them. These were temporal echoes, Richtofen explained through Stullinger, remnants of people trapped in loops created by Element 115's reality warping properties. But the most remarkable resident of Buried was Arthur, a gentle giant who seemed out of place in every way. Arthur stood at least 8 feet tall, with proportions that suggested something other than normal human genetics. Despite his intimidating size, he was kind-hearted and would help Victis if they showed him kindness in return. What Victis didn't know was Arthur's true history. He was the same person as Leroy, who in turn was the servant known as Arthur from medieval times, the one who had scattered the Wolf King's ashes in Der Eisendrache Castle. Temporal distortions and dimensional rifts caused by Element 115 had pulled him forward through time to this place, where he'd been wandering for who knew how long. Arthur would follow them around if they gave him candy, which they could find scattered throughout the town. He would help them fight zombies, would break down barricades, would complete tasks they couldn't manage on their own. In exchange, all he wanted was sweets and kind treatment. It was a small island of innocence in an ocean of horror. The polarization device in Buried was the most powerful of the three, housed deep within the mining facility beneath the town. Activating it would determine the final outcome of the conflict between Richtofen and Maxis. Victis had to make a choice: side with Richtofen and help him maintain his control of the ether, or support Maxis and enable him to seize that power for himself. The decision was agonizing. Richtofen had been helping them through Stullinger, had provided guidance and assistance. But Maxis presented himself as the more sympathetic figure, a father trying to reunite with his daughter. His promises sounded more genuine, less manipulative than Richtofen's. In the canonical timeline, Victis chose to support Maxis. Stullinger argued for following Richtofen, but he couldn't explain why without revealing the voice in his head and his past with the flesh. The others, suspicious of Richtofen from the start, sided with Maxis. When Victis activated the final polarization device in Maxis' favor, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Maxis, his consciousness spread across the devastated Earth through every computer system still functioning, drew upon the power of all three devices simultaneously. The energy signature was enormous, channeling more power than any single point on Earth had contained since the moon rockets fell. And in that moment of ultimate power, Maxis revealed his true nature and intentions. He had been corrupted. The years spent merged with computer systems, exposed to element 115 energy flowing through electronic circuits, had changed him fundamentally. The Apothecons, those ancient entities banished to the Dark Aether, had been whispering to Maxis just as they'd whispered to Richtofen when he touched the moon pyramid device. Every promise of salvation had been a lie. Every assurance about helping humanity survive had been manipulation. Maxis' true goal was to open a gateway to Agartha, using the polarization devices to channel enough power to breach the dimensional barriers. He wanted to bring himself and Samantha into that realm where they could exist together for eternity, and he didn't care what happened to Earth or humanity in the process. As a final act of vengeance against Richtofen, Maxis used his newfound power to trap his former colleague's soul inside a zombie's body. Richtofen, who had spent so long in the godlike position of controlling the undead, was now reduced to shambling among them. His consciousness remained fully intact, trapped in rotting flesh that followed instincts he couldn't control. It was a fate worse than death, and Maxis savored every moment of Richtofen's suffering. Then, on January 19, 2036, Ludwig Maxis destroyed what remained of Earth and every living thing on it. The planet didn't just break this time. It exploded in a cataclysmic event that made the moon rockets look like firecrackers. The energy released was channeled directly to Agartha, where Maxis and Samantha's souls were reunited in the realm beyond physical reality. But something had gone terribly wrong. When Samantha saw her father in Agartha, she realized the corruption had consumed him entirely. This wasn't the loving parent she remembered from childhood. This was a being twisted by the Dark Aether into something monstrous, willing to destroy all of reality to achieve his goals. Horrified by what her father had become, Samantha reached out through a dimensional rift that had formed in the chaos. She called to another version of Maxis, one existing in a different timeline, begging him to help her escape her corrupted father's influence. As for Victis, they seemed doomed. They had been betrayed by both Richtofen and Maxis, used as tools in a cosmic power struggle that had never cared about their survival. As Earth disintegrated around them, as reality itself began to unravel, it appeared their story had reached a tragic end. But Edward Richtofen, even trapped in a zombie's body, still had cards to play. From another dimension, a different version of Richtofen had been watching, planning, preparing for precisely this moment. This alternate Richtofen reached out through the fractured dimensions and contacted Victis, opening a portal that would allow them to escape the dying Earth. Victis had no choice but to trust this new voice. They stepped through the portal as Earth exploded behind them, chased by a horde of zombies led by the undead Richtofen. They had no idea where the portal would take them or what would happen next. They only knew they'd been betrayed again, used again, and their role in this cosmic nightmare was far from over. Behind them, Earth burned in its final moments. Ahead of them lay a future more strange and terrible than they could imagine. And in other dimensions, in other timelines, younger versions of 4 familiar soldiers were embarking on journeys that would determine the fate of all existence. The Victis era had ended in tragedy and betrayal, but their story wasn't finished. They had merely finished one chapter in a book that spanned infinite pages across infinite dimensions. And somewhere in the Dark Aether, ancient forces watched and waited, knowing that the cycle would continue, that the pattern would repeat, that corruption would always find new vessels to exploit. The wheel turned, the cycle ground forward, and for ordinary people who had wanted nothing more than to survive found themselves preserved for purposes they couldn't begin to understand. Call of Duty Zombies Part 5: Origins and the Birth of Primis, a Different Timeline. A new beginning. While Ultimis had been traveling through time fighting zombies and Victis struggled to survive on a dying Earth, a completely different timeline was unfolding in a parallel universe. This was Dimension 63, a reality where history had taken divergent paths. Here, the First World War still raged in 1918, and the events that would lead to Group 935's formation had not yet occurred. But Element 115 had still found its way to this world, and its discovery would set in motion events that would echo across the entire multiverse. In northern France, deep in the Argonne forest near the blood-soaked battlefields of Verdun, German military forces had uncovered something extraordinary during their excavations. What they found wasn't another trench system or bunker. It was ancient ruins of unknown origin, structures that predated any known human civilization by thousands or perhaps millions of years. The dig site revealed buildings and artifacts that spoke to a presence far older than recorded history. Massive stone structures jutted from the earth, covered in symbols that no linguist could decipher. Underground chambers contained technology that shouldn't exist, mechanisms that still functioned despite being buried for ages beyond counting. And at the heart of this discovery was Element 115, found in quantities that dwarfed anything discovered in other timelines. The German Imperial Army, desperate for any advantage in the brutal stalemate of trench warfare, immediately recognized the potential military applications. They established a research facility at the site, naming it Origin, because they believed they had found the source of Element 115's presence on Earth. Soldiers and scientists worked side by side, digging deeper, uncovering more, trying to understand what they had discovered. For soldiers found themselves assigned to this facility, though each arrived through different circumstances, and none could have predicted how their lives were about to change forever. Edward Richtofen in this timeline was not yet the sadistic scientist he would become in other universes. He was a German field medic and scientist, brilliant and ambitious, but not yet corrupted by the Dark Aether's influence. When he looked at the ruins, He saw mysteries waiting to be solved, knowledge waiting to be discovered. He viewed the excavation with scientific curiosity, tempered by cautious optimism, understanding that element 115 represented both incredible potential and terrible danger. Tank Dempsey was here representing the Allied forces, though this version was younger, more idealistic than his Ultimis counterpart. He had been sent to investigate reports of German experimentation with forbidden weapons at the dig site. Dempsey was a soldier through and through, but he hadn't yet been hardened by the grinding horror of endless zombie combat. He still believed in right and wrong, in good guys and bad guys, in the clear moral lines that war was supposed to have. Takeo Masaki arrived as part of a Japanese observer mission. His nation's military was eager to learn about any technological developments that might affect the global balance of power. This Takeo still held firmly to his code of honor, untainted by the betrayal that would define his Ultimis version's character. He carried himself with the dignity of a samurai, viewing his assignment as an opportunity to serve his emperor with distinction. Finally, Nikolai Belinsky represented the Russian Empire's interests at the site. Unlike his Ultimis counterpart, this Nikolai had not yet lost his wife in an air raid. He was still relatively sober, still possessed of hope for the future. He had already begun to see alcohol as a comfort in the face of war's horrors, but it hadn't yet consumed him the way it would consume his alternate self. These four men, starting as potential enemies on a World War I battlefield, would become something far greater than any of them could imagine. They would become Primis, though they did not yet know the significance of that name or the weight of destiny that would fall upon their shoulders. The Origins dig site was a place of wonder and terror in equal measure. Ancient statues of unknown purpose dotted the excavation, their weathered faces seeming to watch the workers with expressions that suggested judgment or perhaps warning. A mysterious gateway stood at the site's center, a circular stone structure covered in glowing symbols that pulsed with energy that made observers' teeth ache and eyes water. Most significantly, they discovered 4 elemental staffs buried in different locations around the excavation. The staff of ice, radiating cold so intense that frost formed on nearby surfaces even in summer heat. The staff of fire, warm to the touch and crackling with barely contained flames. The staff of lightning, arcing with electricity that made hair stand on end. The staff of wind, seeming to pull air toward it in gentle currents that could become hurricanes with the right application of power. These weapons were unlike anything the modern world had seen. They could channel the raw forces of nature itself, creating blizzards that froze zombies solid, firestorms that reduced undead to ash, lightning strikes that chained between dozens of targets, and tornadoes that lifted zombies off their feet and tore them apart. The staffs predated element 115's modern discovery by countless ages, suggesting that ancient civilizations had known about and utilized this element long before modern science stumbled upon it. But the Germans' experiments with element 115 at the dig site had predictable and terrible consequences. The dead began to rise from the battlefields surrounding the excavation. Soldiers killed in trenches just days before returned as zombies, mindlessly attacking anything living. The outbreak spread rapidly, turning the archaeological site into a battlefield where the living fought desperately against an enemy that could not be stopped by conventional means. Bodies piled up, and those bodies rose again minutes later. Machine gun fire that would have shredded human attackers barely slowed the undead. Gas attacks that would have choked entire battalions were ignored by corpses that no longer needed to breathe. The excavation site became a charnel house, and the 4 soldiers who would become Primis found themselves fighting not just for their missions but for their very survival. As the situation deteriorated, Dr. Ludwig Maxis arrived at the site. This version of Maxis was younger than his Ultimis counterpart, not yet the leader of Group 935 but already brilliant and dedicated to understanding element 115's properties. He brought with him his young daughter Samantha and her new companion, a dog named Fluffy who had not yet been transformed into a hellhound. Maxis looked at the ruins with awe and growing concern. He understood better than the soldiers what they were dealing with. Element 115 wasn't just some new element to be cataloged and utilized. It was something that existed partially outside normal physics, something that bent the rules of reality by its very presence. And using it without understanding those properties was catastrophically dangerous. But something else was happening at Origins, something that transcended this single timeline. Samantha from another dimension, the one who had witnessed her father's corruption in Agartha after Maxis destroyed Ultimis's Earth, was reaching out through the dimensional barriers. Her consciousness, existing partially in the ether, could perceive other timelines, other versions of events. And she saw in this timeline an opportunity to prevent the cycle of destruction before it could truly begin. The older Samantha's warnings created a temporal paradox. She told the Dimension 63 Maxis about the Apothecons, about the cycle of destruction that Element 115 perpetuated across infinite timelines, about the need to break that cycle before it consumed everything. She showed him visions of what would happen if they continued down this path. The zombie outbreaks, the destruction of Earth, the endless suffering across countless dimensions. Maxis, horrified by what he learned about his alternate self's fate, began working with both versions of Samantha to formulate a plan that could save all of reality. It would require sacrifices he couldn't fully explain to anyone else. It would require changing the very fabric of existence. But if there was even a chance to prevent the horrors he'd been shown, he had to try. Meanwhile, the 4 soldiers who would become Primis were fighting for their lives against zombie hordes that seemed endless. They discovered that the elemental staffs, when powered by Element 115 and used in conjunction with the ancient gateway at the site, could open a portal to Agartha itself. The staffs had been created during an ancient conflict, weapons forged by humans working alongside the Keepers to fight against the Apothecons. Through fragments of information pieced together from the ruins and from voices that spoke to them in moments of crisis, they began to understand the site's true nature. This wasn't just an archaeological dig. This was a battleground where humanity had once made its stand against forces that sought to consume all of reality. Thousands of years ago, before recorded history, the Apothecons had attempted to invade Earth. They sent their corrupted energies through dimensional rifts, trying to flood the planet with Dark Aether influence and turn it into a gateway through which they could escape their prison. But they had been opposed by the Keepers and by human warriors who refused to let their world fall. Those ancient warriors had wielded the elemental staffs. They had fought alongside beings of immense power against horrors beyond mortal comprehension. And they had won, driving back the Apothecon invasion and sealing the dimensional rifts. But the cost had been enormous, and the victory had never been complete. The Apothecons were patient, and they always found new ways to reach through the barriers. Now, in 1918, history was repeating itself. The discovery of Element 115 at this site had weakened the dimensional barriers once again. The ancient gateway was activating, responding to the Element 115 energy saturating the area. And the Apothecons saw another opportunity to achieve what they had been denied in ages past. Richtofen, Dempsey, Takeo, and Nikolai took up the staffs and fought through the zombie hordes to the gateway. The battle was desperate, chaotic, and seemed impossible to win. But something was guiding them, helping them, showing them what they needed to do. Whether it was the Keepers, the older Samantha reaching through from another dimension, or some other force, they found themselves acting with coordination and purpose that went beyond their training. When they activated the gateway using all 4 staffs simultaneously, they were transported backward through time to the battleground of the Great War itself. Reality twisted around them, and they found themselves pulled across centuries to a conflict that had shaped the fate of the entire world. The Great War was beyond anything they had experienced in the trenches of World War I. This was a conflict that defied normal understanding. Keepers, beings of pure energy and light, clashed with apothecons, twisted monstrosities that seemed to be made of darkness itself and corrupted flesh. Reality warped and bent around the combatants. Fire fell from the sky. The ground split open to reveal abysses that led to the Dark Aether. And in the midst of this chaos were humans, warriors from an age before written history, fighting with weapons that blazed with elemental power. These were the first Primis, the original defenders who had stood against the Apothecon invasion. When the four soldiers from 1918 appeared, the ancient warriors recognized them as reinforcements sent by forces beyond their understanding. The battle raged for what felt like days but might have been longer. Time flowed strangely during the Great War, compressed and expanded by the reality-bending energies being thrown around. Richtofen, Dempsey, Takeo, and Nikolai fought alongside the Wolf King, a legendary warrior who commanded human forces with strategic brilliance and personal courage. Together, they managed to drive back the Apothecon forces. The staffs channeled enough power to seal the dimensional rifts the Apothecons had opened. The Keepers reinforced those seals with their own energies, creating barriers that would hold for thousands of years. The victory came at tremendous cost. Many human warriors fell, and the land itself was scarred by the conflict, but it gave humanity a chance to survive and prosper. After the Great War, the four soldiers who had come from 1918 did not immediately return to their own time. They remained in the ancient past, helping to rebuild what the war had destroyed and ensuring that knowledge about the Apothecons and Keepers would be preserved for future generations. They instructed the Wolf King to build a castle on a strategic location, a fortress that would serve as both a defensive position and a repository of knowledge. Der Eisendrake, it would be called, and it would stand for millennia as a monument to the battle that had saved the world. They ensured that certain artifacts and weapons would be preserved, hidden away until the time was right for their rediscovery. The four soldiers taught the survivors about the staffs, about Element 115, about the dangers of tampering with forces beyond human understanding. They became legends in their own right, remembered in stories and songs that would be passed down through generations, their names and deeds gradually transforming into myths as centuries passed. Eventually, their journey through time brought them to a place beyond normal space and time, a realm that existed between dimensions. Here, they encountered Dr. Monty, one of the original Keepers who had watched the multiverse since the beginning. Monty appeared to them as a friendly figure, charming and helpful, offering guidance and explanations about what they had experienced. Monty explained that the multiverse was fracturing. The original timeline where Ultimis had traveled from World War II to the moon and destroyed Earth was creating ripples across all dimensions. These ripples were weakening the barriers between universes, creating fractures through which the Apothecons could potentially return. The cycle of destruction that had consumed one timeline was threatening to spread to others. Monty presented himself as someone trying to fix these problems. To heal the fractures and create a perfect world where the Apothecons could never threaten reality again. He told Primis that they were central to his plan, that their actions could save all of existence. But to do that, they would need to gather certain artifacts and souls, pieces of a cosmic puzzle that would allow them to challenge the very foundations of the corrupted multiverse. At the center of this plan was one crucial artifact, the summoning key. This Keeper-created device could manipulate the ether directly, trap souls within it, and use their energy to reshape reality. If Primis could obtain the summoning key, they would have the power to confront the Apothecons and the corrupted timeline that threatened all of existence. But obtaining the key would not be easy. It was located in Dimension 63, in a city called Morgue City, guarded by forces that would not surrender it willingly. And there was another problem. The Shadow Man, the original corrupted keeper, had his own designs on the summoning key and the people of Morgue City. Monty explained all of this in his charming way, making it sound like an adventure, a noble quest to save reality. He didn't mention the sacrifices that would be required. He didn't explain that Primis would have to kill alternate versions of themselves to stabilize certain timelines. He didn't reveal that the perfect world he was creating might not be as perfect as he claimed. But even if Monty had revealed everything, what choice did Primis have? They had seen the Great War, had witnessed what the Apothicons were capable of. They understood that the stakes were infinite, that failure meant not just their deaths but the deaths of everyone across all dimensions. If there was even a chance to prevent that, they had to take it. And so Primis accepted their mission. They would gather the artifacts Monty needed. They would confront the corrupted timeline. They would do whatever was necessary to save reality from the Apothicons. They were 4 soldiers who had started as enemies on a World War I battlefield. They had become heroes who saved the ancient world from dimensional invasion. And now they would become something more, champions who would fight across infinite timelines to break the cycle of destruction that threatened all of existence. They were Primis. They were the first and would be the last. And their story was about to become far more complicated than any of them could imagine. The journey from origins to the final confrontation would take them through hell itself, through moments of triumph and tragedy, through choices that would haunt them forever. But they would face it together, these 4 soldiers who had been forged in the fires of the Great War into something greater than they had ever been before. Their legend was just beginning, and the multiverse would tremble before it was done. Call of Duty Zombies Part 6. The Primis' journey gathering souls. Breaking Fate's Primis' first major objective after leaving the ancient past was to obtain the summoning key from Morgue City, located in Dimension 63 on October 31st, 1943. This dimension held special importance because it was where Samantha had reached out to her father, creating a version of Maxie's who understood the Apothicon threat and actively worked against it. But Morgue City had its own problems, and the Shadow Man had been watching this city for years. Morgue City was a noir-inspired urban landscape of corruption and moral decay, a place where the American dream had curdled into something dark and poisonous. Jazz music drifted from speakeasies while murders happened in alleyways. Police turned blind eyes to organized crime in exchange for payoffs. The wealthy lived in luxury while the poor struggled to survive. It was, in short, the perfect feeding ground for the Shadow Man. He had identified 4 specific individuals whose sins made them vulnerable to manipulation. These were not evil people by nature, but circumstances and poor choices had led them down paths that left them desperate for redemption. Desperate enough to listen to whispered promises from a voice that claimed to offer salvation. Jessica Rose was a magician's assistant who had killed her employer after enduring his abuse for years. The magician had used her, controlled her, made her feel worthless. One night, pushed beyond her breaking point, she had fought back. It was self-defense in many ways, but the law wouldn't see it that way. The guilt ate at her, made worse by the knowledge that some part of her had wanted him dead. Floyd Campbell was a boxer, a man who had made his living with his fists. He'd killed his manager in a moment of rage when he discovered the man had been stealing from him, fixing fights, destroying his career for personal profit. Floyd wasn't a violent man by nature, but in that moment of betrayal, his training and anger had combined into something deadly. Now he lived with the knowledge that he'd taken a life over money. Jack Vincent was a corrupt cop who had murdered his partner to hide his own crimes. He'd been on the take for years, accepting bribes, looking the other way when criminals paid him to. His partner had discovered the corruption and threatened to expose him. Jack had made a choice, his freedom or his partner's life. He'd chosen wrong, and now both were gone. Nero Blackstone was an alcoholic magician who had killed a fan in a drunken encounter. He barely remembered the incident, his mind fogged by whiskey and guilt, but he knew what he'd done, knew that his weakness for alcohol had led to someone's death. The bottle had been his escape from failure and disappointment, and now it had made him a murderer. The Shadow Man approached each of them in different guises, always charming, always understanding, always offering exactly what they needed to hear. He told them they could redeem themselves, wash away their sins, start anew. All they had to do was perform certain rituals, gather specific artifacts, and speak the words he taught them. Desperate for salvation, the four agreed. On Halloween night 1943, the Shadow Man guided them through rituals that required collecting artifacts scattered across Morgue City and using them at specific ritual sites. The artifacts were strange: an ancient sword, a golden fountain pen, a championship belt, a police badge, each connected to the person carrying it in ways they didn't fully understand, resonating with their pasts and their sins. What Jessica, Floyd, Jack, and Nero didn't realize was that they were opening dimensional rifts. With each ritual completed, the barriers between the physical world and the Dark Aether weakened. Apothecon creatures began seeping into Morgue City, transforming it into a nightmare landscape where tentacles erupted from the ground and the sky split open to reveal darkness beyond darkness. By the time they completed the final ritual, Morgue City was lost. The Apothecons flooded through the dimensional rifts in force. The Shadow Man revealed his true form, not the friendly figure who had guided them, but a monstrous being of pure corruption and malevolence. He had never intended to save them. They were simply tools to open the gateway that would allow the Apothecons to return to our dimension. But the Keepers had not abandoned Morgue City. They appeared to oppose the Shadow Man, providing the four sinners with powerful weapons and artifacts that could be used to fight back. Keeper swords materialized in their hands, weapons that could cut through Apothecon flesh and channel elemental energies. The Keepers showed them how to trap the Shadow Man, how to use his own power against him. A desperate battle ensued. Jessica, Floyd, Jack, and Nero fought not just for their lives but for their souls, for the city around them, for the chance at genuine redemption rather than the false salvation the Shadow Man had promised. They battled through streets overrun with Apothecon monstrosities, fought against creatures that defied description, pushed themselves beyond what they thought possible. Against all odds, they succeeded. They cornered the Shadow Man, used the Keeper artifacts to weaken him, and trapped him inside the summoning key itself. The ancient device absorbed his essence, containing one of the most powerful Apothecons in existence within its crystalline structure. The Keepers sealed the dimensional rifts, preventing the full Apothecon invasion from manifesting. The four had redeemed themselves not through the Shadow Man's false promises, but through genuine heroism in the face of impossible odds. They had faced the consequences of their sins, had fought against the very embodiment of corruption, and had won. At that moment, Edward Richtofen of Primis arrived through a portal. He had been watching and waiting for the precise moment when the Shadow Man would be trapped in the summoning key. Richtofen thanked the four for their efforts, his words sincere but brief. Then he grabbed the summoning key and departed before they could fully process what had happened. Jessica, Floyd, Jack, and Nero were left in the ruins of Morgue City, their fate uncertain but their redemption earned. They had broken the Shadow Man's plan and given Primis the tool they needed to save the multiverse. With the summoning key in hand, Primis could proceed to the next phase of their mission. But Monty's plan was more complex than simply gathering artifacts. The fractures in the multiverse needed to be healed, and that meant going to the original timeline, the Ultimis timeline, and changing key events. Specifically, they needed to prevent Ultimis from continuing their journey as it had originally unfolded. This meant killing the Ultimis versions of themselves and collecting their souls in the summoning key, removing them from the timeline before they could cause further damage to reality's fabric. It was a grim task made more terrible by the fact that they would essentially be committing murder against alternate versions of themselves. These weren't abstract concepts or distant relatives. These were them, just older, more damaged, having walked different paths. But Monty insisted it was necessary for reality's salvation. Samantha, watching from the house where Monty kept her safe, sent Primis to their first destination, Der Eisendrache, a castle in Austria that had been converted into a Group 935 facility. This was the very castle that the Wolf King had built on Primis's instruction ages ago, now serving as a research station where the Ultimis version of Dempsey was being held in cryogenic storage. Primis arrived at Der Eisendrache on November 5, 1945, in the middle of a timeline fracture called Deceptio. The castle was magnificent even in ruins, with stone walls that had stood for centuries and modern German military technology awkwardly integrated into medieval architecture. But it was also overrun with zombies, and a massive rocket facility had been built into the mountain beneath it. Giant mechanical dragons flew through the air, remnants of Group 935's experiments with Element 115 power technology. These weren't living creatures but machines, robots built to incredible scale and given artificial intelligence that made them seem almost alive. They had been weapons once, but now they were just another hazard in a facility full of dangers. The mission was straightforward in concept, but emotionally devastating in execution. Primis had to free Ultimis Dempsey from his cryopod, then kill him before he could be awakened and continue his original journey. When they found him, Primis Dempsey looked into the face of his older, more damaged self. The Ultimis Dempsey, barely conscious, seemed to understand what was happening. His eyes focused on his younger self with something like recognition or perhaps relief. He'd been fighting for so long, had endured so much, had been used and manipulated until there was barely anything left of the man he'd once been. Maybe this was mercy. Maybe this was what he'd wanted all along without knowing it. His last words before Primis Dempsey pulled the trigger were simple: "It's good to see ya, Tank." Then the gunshot, and Ultimis Dempsey's soul was pulled from his body and trapped in the summoning key, preserved for purposes none of them fully understood. Primis Dempsey stood there for a long moment, staring at the body of the man he might have become. Then he turned away and moved on, because that's what soldiers do. They complete the mission no matter how it makes them feel. One soul down, 2 to go. The next destination was Zetsubu no Shima, a Japanese island facility where Group 935 had conducted some of their most horrific experiments. The name meant Island of Extinction, and it was aptly named. This facility specialized in botanical research, using Element 115 to create massive zombie plant hybrids and other biological weapons. The island was a nightmare landscape of mutated vegetation and shambling corpses. Giant plants with teeth grew alongside trees that bled when cut. Flowers released spores that caused hallucinations or paralysis. The very ground seemed alive, reaching for them with tendrils and vines. Here, Primis found Ultimis Takeo, who had been captured during his service in the Imperial Army. But this mission proved more complicated than Der Eisendrache. When Primis Takeo confronted his older self, they spoke at length about honor, duty, and the nature of their mission. Ultimis Takeo learned that the emperor he had served so loyally had betrayed him, sending him on a suicide mission just to dispose of a soldier who had somehow become inconvenient. The revelation broke something in him. Everything he had believed in, everything he had sacrificed for, had been built on lies. But rather than collapsing into despair, Ultimis Takeo made a choice. He chose to die with honor, to give his death meaning even if his life had been built on deception. Rather than being executed by his younger self, he asked to commit seppuku, the ritual suicide reserved for warriors who wished to die with dignity. Primis Takeo performed the role of Kaishakunin, delivering the final blow to end his older self's suffering. It was an act of mercy and respect, warrior to warrior, one Takeo to another. The older version died with dignity, and his soul joined Dempsey's in the summoning key. 2 down. 1 to go for the original Primis crew. But there was another soul they would need, a 4th member of Ultimis whose fate was tied up in the very fabric of their journey. The 3rd soul required taking Primis to Gorod Krovi, a war-torn Stalingrad in 1945 where Ultimis Nikolai had somehow gained control of a massive robotic dragon and was using it to fight through hordes of zombies. The Soviets had continued Group 935's research after the war, and Stalingrad had become a testing ground for their most advanced Element 115-powered weapons. The city was a hellscape. Buildings burned despite the rain. The streets ran red with blood and ash. German and Soviet technology mixed in impossible combinations, creating weapons and defenses that shouldn't exist but did. And in the sky, the dragon flew, breathing fire and lightning while Ultimis Nikolai rode on its back, drunk and laughing like a madman. Primis descended from the sky in parachutes, landing directly in front of Ultimis Nikolai's position. The older Russian, drunk and battle-weary, initially tried to kill them before realizing they were versions of his companions. Primis Nikolai tried to reason with his older self, to explain what needed to happen and why. The conversation that followed was deeply personal and heartbreaking. Both Nikolais had lost their wives to the war, both had drowned their pain in vodka, both had become shells of the men they once were. But Primis Nikolai still had hope that things could be different, that the cycle could be broken. Ultimis Nikolai, looking at his younger self, seemed to find peace in the idea that at least one version of him might escape the endless suffering. When Ultimis Nikolai fell in battle against the zombie hordes and the monstrous creatures that Group 935 had created, Primis Nikolai collected his soul. 3 souls were now in the summoning key, but there was one more they needed, and this one would prove the most difficult and consequential of all. They needed Edward Richtofen's soul, but not just any Richtofen. They needed the soul of the Richtofen who had touched the MPD, who had been corrupted by the Apothecons, who had set all of these terrible events in motion. They needed the soul of Ultimis Richtofen from the very moment before he betrayed Maxis and Samantha at Der Rees. Samantha sent Primis back to Der Rees in October 1945, creating a new fracture in the timeline. Primis' versions of Dempsey, Takeo, and Nikolai infiltrated the facility while their Ultimis counterparts were still in cryo-storage. Unaware that they were about to have their fate stolen from them, they confronted Ultimis Richtofen just after he had teleported Maxis and Samantha away, but before he could awaken the test subjects who would become his unwitting pawns. The man stood there, the original Edward Richtofen, the one whose corruption would spawn timelines of suffering and death. The teleporter activated, and Primis Richtofen emerged holding the summoning key. He looked at his older self, saw the madness already taking root in Ultimis Richtofen's eyes, understood what this man would become if left alive. The choice should have been difficult, but it wasn't. This was a mercy killing, the execution of a monster before he could fully emerge. Without hesitation, Primis Richtofen shot Ultimis Richtofen in the head, killing him instantly. The gunshot echoed through Der Rees, and with it, the entire Ultimis timeline shattered like glass struck by a hammer. Everything that Ultimis had done from this point forward was now impossible. The journey to the moon, the body swap with Samantha, Earth's destruction. All of it negated by a single bullet. But fractures don't heal cleanly. The timeline splintered, creating alternate realities where different versions of events played out. The multiverse became increasingly unstable, and Primis had just made it infinitely worse even as they tried to fix it. With all 4 Ultimis souls collected in the summoning key, Primis could proceed to the final phase of Monty's plan. They traveled to Revelations, a pocket dimension where the barriers between the ether and physical reality were at their thinnest. Here, they would attempt to heal the fractures and help Monty create his perfect world. But the Shadow Man, trapped in the summoning key, had not been idle. He manipulated Primis into bringing the key to Revelations, to a place where dimensional barriers were weak enough that he could break free. When they arrived at the appointed location, the Shadow Man shattered the summoning key from within and escaped, immediately beginning to tear down the barriers between dimensions. The Apothecons flooded into Revelations. Massive, squid-like monstrosities filled the sky. The landscape twisted and changed, pulled between the physical realm and the Dark Aether. Monty's perfect world was under direct attack, and if the Shadow Man succeeded, all of reality would be consumed. Primis fought desperately alongside the Keepers against the Apothecon invasion. They wielded the elemental staffs they had used during the Great War, channeling the power of ancient warriors who had fought this same battle eons ago. Reality warped around them as energies beyond mortal comprehension clashed. In a final desperate gambit, Primis managed to use the summoning key's shattered fragments to trap the Shadow Man once more. Without their leader, the Apothecons began to lose cohesion. The Keepers pushed back, driving the Dark Aether forces through dimensional rifts. Monty sealed the barriers, banishing the Apothecons for what everyone hoped would be the final time. Victory seemed assured. Monty began creating his perfect world, one where Element 115 had never existed, where the Apothecons could never return, where humanity could live in peace. Samantha and the child versions of the Primis crew would grow up in this paradise. But there was a problem. Primis themselves were still present. They should have faded from existence once the fractures were healed, but they remained. Monty realized why: the blood vials they carried. Earlier in their journey, Primis had traveled to Alcatraz to collect blood samples from 4 individuals trapped in a temporal prison. These 4, Salvatore De Luca, Billy Handsome, Albert Arlington, and Michael Finnegan, were caught in a cycle of their own, reliving the night of their failed escape attempt endlessly. Blood from people trapped in closed temporal loops had special properties. It could preserve someone's existence even when the timeline said they should disappear. By carrying these blood vials, Primis had created a paradox. They couldn't fade away because the blood anchored them to reality. But their continued existence threatened everything Monty had built. Monty contemplated erasing Primis from existence, but then he had what seemed like a better idea. He would send them back to the Great War, back to the beginning, to fight alongside the original Primis warriors. This would close the loop perfectly. Primis would become the ancient heroes they had fought alongside, preserved by necessity in the past. As Primis faded into the past, sent to fight an eternal war against the Apothecons, Monty smiled. The cycle was complete. Everything was as it should be. His perfect world could proceed without interruption. But Primis Richtofen had been reading the Chronorium, and he had learned a terrible truth that would change everything. Call of Duty Zombies Part 7. Breaking the Cycle, The Final Sacrifice. The Chronorium was a book that existed outside of normal time, a tome that recorded all of history across all dimensions simultaneously. Reading it was not like reading a normal book. The pages shifted and changed based on who was reading them and when. It showed possible futures, alternate timelines, the consequences of choices not yet made. And Edward Richtofen, studying the Chronorium in stolen moments while his companions rested, had learned something that shook him to his core. Dr. Monty was corrupted by the Dark Aether. The friendly figure who had guided them, who had presented himself as their ally in the fight against the Apothecons, was himself touched by the same corruption that had transformed the Shadow Man. Monty's perfect world was not a paradise but another prison, another cycle that would perpetuate suffering indefinitely. The great war that Primis had been sent back to fight would never truly end. They would be trapped in that conflict for eternity, fighting the same battles over and over while Monty shaped reality according to his corrupted vision. But the Chronorium also showed a way out, a solution that would require sacrifices almost too terrible to contemplate. Primis would have to destroy themselves and every version of themselves across all timelines and dimensions. They would have to erase their own existence from reality and take element 115 with them, banishing it all to the Dark Aether where it could never threaten creation again. The cycle had to be broken, completely. Finally, no matter the cost. Richtofen kept this knowledge to himself at first, trying to process what it meant, trying to find another way. But the Chronorium was clear. There was no other path that led to genuine freedom. Every other option eventually circled back to corruption, to suffering, to the endless repetition of the same terrible patterns. After spending years fighting in the Great War as Monty had intended, Primis found a way to return to the present. The Chronorium had shown Richtofen the mechanisms to escape the temporal loop, and he'd guided his team through the process without fully explaining why. They emerged in a timeline that intersected with multiple others, a place where they could access different versions of themselves and different versions of events. But Richtofen now understood that Monty's plan was fundamentally flawed. The cycle couldn't be broken by simply fixing fractures and creating a perfect world. The cycle had to be destroyed from within, and that meant Primis had to destroy themselves. The first step was returning to Alcatraz, but not the Alcatraz of 1941 where they had obtained the blood vials. This was Alcatraz in a pocket dimension, a place called Blood of the Dead where 4 mobsters, Michael Finn O'Leary, Albert the Weasel Arlington, Salvatore Sal DeLuca, and Billy Handsome, were trapped in an endless cycle of their own. These 4 had been executed at Alcatraz in the 1930s for attempting to escape. But the Shadow Man had manipulated events to create a temporal prison around their deaths, trapping their souls in a loop where they would relive the night of their escape attempt endlessly. The Shadow Man had used them to create and maintain the pocket dimension, planning to eventually use it to trap Primis and harvest their blood for opening gateways to Agartha. When Primis arrived at Blood of the Dead on July 4, 2018, they found themselves trapped in this pocket dimension, unable to escape as zombies poured in from all directions. But Richtofen had another version of himself hidden here, an alternate Richtofen who had been frozen in cryogenic storage beneath Alcatraz. This alternate possessed the original Chronorium and knowledge that the Primis version needed to complete their mission. The Chronorium revealed a terrible truth to Richtofen. To break the cycle, one of them would have to die here. The blood vials that had preserved their existence needed to be destroyed. But more than that, a sacrifice was required to power the ritual that would free the others and set them on the path to ultimate victory. Richtofen understood that he was the one who had to die. His alternate self could take his place. The cycle could only be broken if the specific version of Richtofen, the one who had been manipulating events, who carried the weight of all their journey's sins, who knew too much about what was coming, was removed from the timeline. When he revealed this to his companions, they refused to accept it. They had fought together for so long, been through so much, that the idea of losing Richtofen was unbearable. But Nikolai, after reading the Chronorium himself, understood what Richtofen had been trying to tell them all along. This wasn't just about Richtofen needing to die. This was about all of them needing to die to truly end the cycle. Nikolai made a choice that would define the rest of their journey. He refused to save Richtofen, instead allowing him to sacrifice himself to the mechanism that would free them from Alcatraz. As Richtofen died, his soul was absorbed by ancient machinery built by the Shadow Man, and a portal opened. The alternate Richtofen emerged from cryostorage, now the leader of Primis in place of the one who had guided them since Origins. This new Richtofen brought devastating news. Monty was not just corrupted, he was actively working to prevent them from breaking the cycle. The perfect world Monty wanted to create was one where he would have ultimate control, where the Keepers would rule over humanity forever, where the cycle of suffering would continue under new management. The only way to truly save reality was to destroy the entire multiverse that had been touched by Element 115 and the Apothecons. Every timeline, every dimension, every fragment of reality where corruption had taken root had to be banished to the Dark Aether and sealed away forever. To accomplish this, they needed several crucial artifacts working in concert. The Elemental Shard, which could channel massive amounts of energy. The Summoning Key, which could manipulate the ether itself. And most importantly, they needed the cooperation of both their Ultimis counterparts and the Victis crew. Primis traveled to Area 51 in the year 1963, to a facility called Classified where the Ultimis crew had been imprisoned after being teleported from the moon following Earth's destruction. When Primis arrived, they found their alternate selves in cryostorage, being kept by a scientist named Cornelius Purnell. Purnell had been experimenting on himself with Element 115, trying to gain powers that would allow him to combat Samantha's influence over the zombies. The experiments had gone catastrophically wrong, transforming him into a being called the Avogadro, an energy-based entity of immense power but fragmented consciousness. He was no longer fully human, existing partially as electricity and partially as corrupted flesh. Primis had to defeat Purnell to free Ultimis, a battle that took them through the shadowy halls of Groom Lake's secret laboratories. The Avogadro could teleport through electrical systems, could possess electronics, could attack from multiple directions simultaneously. But Primis had fought worse. They destroyed the entity that had once been a patriotic American scientist, and in doing so, freed the Ultimis crew from their imprisonment. With Ultimis freed, both crews traveled together to Camp Edward in Nevada, another Broken Arrow facility where the Elemental Shard was being kept. But this mission was particularly dangerous because Dr. Monty had become aware of what they were attempting. Monty appeared before them at Camp Edward, revealing his true nature as a keeper corrupted by the Dark Aether. The friendly facade fell away, and they saw him for what he really was, an ancient being who had manipulated events across countless timelines for his own purposes, who saw humanity as children to be controlled rather than free agents deserving of choice. To demonstrate his power and his willingness to destroy anyone who threatened his plans, Monty killed the Dimension 63 version of Ludwig Maxis right in front of Samantha. He devoured Maxis' soul, demonstrating that even the scientists and researchers who had tried to help were expendable in Monty's grand design. This brutal act finally made Samantha understand that Monty was not the benevolent protector he claimed to be. She joined forces with Primis and Ultimis, along with Eddie, the child version of Richtofen from Monty's house, to oppose the being who had been manipulating all of them. At Camp Edward, they defeated the remnants of the Avogadro's power and retrieved the Elemental Shard. They also acquired weapons and tools they would need for the final confrontation. But before they could proceed, they needed Victis to complete their part of the plan. Primis Richtofen had been communicating with Victis through Stullinger, using the connection established during the Maxis versus Richtofen conflict. He guided Victis through portals across dimensions, having them collect components needed to construct the Agarthan device, an artifact capable of granting its user anything they truly desired if powered correctly. The Agarthan device was ancient Keeper technology, one of the most powerful artifacts ever created. It had been hidden in Angola, in the town of Purgatory Point where Jebediah Brown had first discovered the Pack-a-Punch machine. The device required specific components: the blood of an Apothecon, an elemental shard, and a metallic vessel to contain the energies it would channel. Victis fought through multiple dimensions gathering these components, never fully understanding what they were building or why. They were told it would save them, would give them the freedom they'd been promised so many times before. But there was no freedom coming. There was only one final use for them in the grand design. The The final destination was Toten, a facility in Siberia built on the site where the Tunguska event had occurred in 1908. This location held massive deposits of element 115 and was one of the strongest connection points between our dimension and the Dark Aether. It was here that the cycle would finally end. Victis arrived first, fighting through zombie hordes to construct the Agarthan device according to the instructions they'd been given. Meanwhile, Primis and Ultimis gathered in a nearby forest, preparing for what they all now understood would be their last night alive. 8 warriors who had fought across space and time sat around a campfire. They shared stories, made confessions, spoke of regrets and moments of joy. It was the last time they would all be together, and each of them knew it. Ultimis Richtofen, no longer the sadistic madman but somehow redeemed through his journey, asked for forgiveness from those he had wronged. The others, understanding what he had become versus what he had been, granted it. Ultimis Dempsey spoke about the simple life he wished he could have lived. A house, a family, peace. Ultimis Takeo shared wisdom from his code of honor, finding solace in the idea that death with purpose was better than life without meaning. Ultimis Nikolai toasted to his wife's memory one final time, the vodka in his flask tasting both bitter and sweet. He had never truly moved past her death, but perhaps now, in whatever came after, he could find peace. The Primis crew was more resigned, having known this was coming for longer. Primis Dempsey made jokes to hide his fear, maintaining the soldier's facade until the very end. Primis Takeo meditated on the nature of sacrifice, finding spiritual acceptance in what they were about to do. Primis Richtofen contemplated the Chronorium's prophecies and wondered if they had made the right choices. And Primis Nikolai, the one who would have to carry the burden of ending it all, simply sat and drank, preparing himself for what came next. At dawn, they proceeded to tag Der Toten. Victis had completed construction of the Agarthan device but needed the final components. The elemental shard that Primis and Ultimis had retrieved from Camp Edward, and the summoning key that Primis still possessed. When all components were assembled, Primis Nikolai enacted the final phase. He had prepared poisoned vodka, lacing it with a substance that would kill painlessly and peacefully. He offered drinks to both crews, telling them it was to celebrate their victory, to honor their sacrifice. They all drank, even knowing what it contained. It was easier this way than facing execution or violent death. The poison worked quickly, making them drowsy, peaceful. They said their final goodbyes to each other and to the universe they had fought so hard to save. Ultimis Richtofen had one last act of kindness. He communicated with Samuel Stullinger, who was desperately calling out for guidance about what Victis should do next. Richtofen, this man who had caused so much suffering and manipulated countless people, spoke words of genuine sorrow. "I know, Sammy, and I am so very sorry." Victis understood then that they had been betrayed one final time. There would be no reward, no escape, no salvation. They had built the device that would end the multiverse, and they would die along with it. As Primis and Ultimis fell into their final sleep, one remained. Primis Nikolai had consumed less poison, staying conscious long enough to complete the final act. He approached the Agarthan device and inserted the summoning key into its heart. The device activated with power that shook reality's foundations. It began drawing all versions of element 115 from across the entire multiverse, pulling it inexorably toward the Dark Aether. Every meteor, every experiment, every zombie that had ever risen, all of it was being unmade, erased from existence. The Apothecons tried to intervene but were dragged back into the Dark Aether along with everything they had touched. The Shadow Man screamed his fury as he was banished for the final time. The corrupted keepers were torn from their hiding places and sealed away. Even Monty himself was pulled into the Dark Aether, his plans destroyed, his perfect world unmade. Primis Nikolai watched as reality unraveled. He saw Victis desperately trying to escape, running toward portals that wouldn't save them. He saw his companions' bodies fading into nothingness as the timeline erased their existence. He saw creation's light dimming as Element 115's corruption was torn away. With his last strength, Nikolai called out to Samantha. She appeared before him holding a weapon. It had to be her. She was the only one not touched by Element 115 in this timeline, the only one who could survive to bear witness to what they had done. "Break the cycle," Nikolai whispered. "Remember us, but move forward." Samantha, tears streaming down her face, pulled the trigger. Primis Nikolai fell, the last of the warriors to sacrifice himself for reality's salvation. The Agarthan device completed its work. The entire multiverse touched by Element 115 was pulled into the Dark Aether and sealed away forever. Primis, Ultimis, Victis, and countless other versions of these characters across infinite dimensions. All of it was gone, banished where it could never threaten reality again. A new universe was born in that moment, completely free from Element 115's taint. Samantha Maxey's and Eddie Richtofen, the children preserved from Monty's house, walked through a door of light into this new reality in the year 1984. The cycle was broken. The story was over, or so it seemed. Call of Duty Zombies Part 8 and 9. The Dark Aether saga, a new beginning in the shadows. The new universe that Samantha and Eddie stepped into was pristine, untouched by Element 115's corruption. They grew up with no memory of the Aether story, no recollection of their roles in the multiverse's salvation. It should have been paradise, a fresh start for reality itself. But even in this new timeline, free from Element 115's original taint, the past would not stay buried forever. Samantha Maxey's became a BND agent working in Germany, skilled and dedicated, never knowing she had once been a child trapped in a pyramid with godlike powers. Edward Richtofen married, had a son, and joined the CIA, eventually rising to positions of significant authority. His memories of the old timeline would return eventually, but for years he lived as an ordinary man, or as ordinary as a high-level intelligence operative could be. But the Dark Aether, now bloated with all the energy and souls banished to it at Tag der Toten, pressed against the barriers between dimensions. It was a realm of infinite hunger, swollen with the collective suffering of countless timelines, and it wanted to feed on this fresh, uncorrupted reality. The first breach occurred in 1945, during World War II's final days. Nazi scientists, working without any knowledge of Group 935 or the original timeline, discovered ways to manipulate spacetime. They called their project Project Endstation, and it involved a particle accelerator designed to probe reality's fundamental nature. What they didn't know was that their experiments thinned the barrier between our dimension and the Dark Aether. On November 7, 1945, during a test at the facility in Morasko, Poland, Dr. Ulrich Vogel and his team activated the cyclotron at full power. The barrier shattered. A rift opened directly to the Dark Aether, and through it poured energies that transformed everyone nearby. The dead rose as zombies, their eyes glowing with power from the other dimension. Scientists were corrupted and twisted into monstrous forms. Reality began to buckle under the strain of two dimensions attempting to occupy the same space. A Soviet soldier named Kazimir Zykov was present during the accident. Realizing the portal couldn't be sealed from outside, he made the choice to sacrifice himself. Zykov entered the rift and sealed it from within the Dark Aether, trapping himself in that nightmare dimension to save his comrades and the world. What happened to Zykov in the Dark Aether was a tragedy of cosmic proportions. Time moved differently there. What was approximately 48 years in our world translated to roughly 4 centuries in that twisted realm. He found himself in a place of endless hunger and madness, surrounded by entities banished from the old multiverse. The nature of what Zykov encountered suggests that fragments of the old ether story may have survived in some form. The souls of those who had died touched by element 115 would have been pulled into this realm, and ancient beings called the Old Ones, entities that had dwelt in the Dark Aether since before the Keepers and Apothecons, still ruled there. Based on what we know from Zykov's own journal entries, his initial heroism slowly degraded into something darker. To survive, he consumed the energies of other beings in the Dark Aether, growing in power but losing his humanity with each feeding. He appears to have defeated and absorbed other entities, including members of a cult called Sparagmos who worshipped the Old Ones, taking their disciples as servants. After what felt like eternity, though approximately 48 years passed on Earth, Zykov had become something entirely different. He had consumed so much dark energy that he transformed into a being of immense power. He became known as the Forsaken, a godlike entity who ruled significant portions of the Dark Aether and dreamed of conquering our dimension. The Forsaken believed that by merging our world with the Dark Aether, he could end all conflict. In his corrupted mind, he saw himself as a savior who would bring peace through forced unity, not recognizing that he had become a tyrant seeking to devour all reality. In our dimension, life continued without knowledge of what lurked beyond the dimensional barriers. But the Forsaken was patient. He began whispering through the veil to those whose minds were open to such influences. He found his first major prophet in a young Russian girl named Valentina. Valentina grew up plagued by visions she didn't understand. The Forsaken appeared to her in dreams, taking the form of her dead father, telling her she had a special destiny. He filled her head with promises of power and purpose, grooming her to become his agent in our world. She infiltrated the Soviet Omega Group, a military research organization, and rose through the ranks, orchestrating events to ensure the Project End Station site would be rediscovered. In 1983, Valentina's manipulation bore fruit. The Soviets found the old End Station facility and, following procedures detailed in documents she had discovered, reactivated the particle accelerator. Once again, a rift opened to the Dark Aether. This time, there was no Zykov to seal it. Outbreak zones began appearing across the globe as the veil between dimensions weakened. The dead rose as zombies powered by Etherium, a crystallized form of dark ether energy even more potent and unstable than element 115 had been. The United States government detected these outbreaks and mobilized a response. Edward Richtofen, now a CIA director with no memory of his previous life, proposed the formation of a special task force called Requiem. This CIA-backed organization would contain dark ether breaches and study Etherium with the goal of weaponizing it for America's advantage in the Cold War. Requiem's leadership consisted of several key figures. Grigory Weaver, a veteran CIA operative who had worked with both Richtofen and Samantha Maxey's over the years, served as Field Operations Director. Dr. Elizabeth Gray led the Unnatural Sciences Division. Major Mackenzie Carver handled security and containment. Dr. Oscar Strauss, who had actually worked at the original End Station facility before its disaster, led energy research. The Soviet Union formed their own response, Omega Group, led by Colonel Lev Kravchenko. Where Requiem sought to contain and study, Omega wanted to exploit the Dark Aether's power to secure Soviet victory in the Cold War. The first major Requiem operation was at Die Machine, the code name for the reopened End Station facility. On November 13, 1983, a Requiem strike team deployed to Poland with a mission to shut down the particle accelerator and close the rift. What they found was a nightmare. The facility was overrun with zombies emanating from the Dark Aether breach. Reality distorted around the rift, creating zones where physics didn't apply normally. Within the Dark Aether itself, they encountered creatures so saturated with Etherium that they could split into multiple entities. The strike team succeeded in destroying the cyclotron and collapsing the rift. But the victory was temporary. The veil between dimensions had been weakened across the globe, and closing one rift didn't stop others from forming. The Cold War escalates into dimensional conflict. The next major crisis occurred in Vietnam. Samantha Maxey's, working as a BND agent, had been investigating Omega Group's activities in the region. She discovered that Omega was building a massive research facility at the site of a former American firebase near Kisan. Omega's lead scientist, Dr. William Peck, was conducting experiments that would allow stable portals to the Dark Aether to remain open indefinitely. Samantha attempted to infiltrate the facility but was captured by Peck. Rather than interrogating her properly, Peck made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. He threw Samantha into the Dark Aether itself, disposing of her so he could continue his research without interference. What Peck didn't realize was that Samantha was no ordinary agent. The moment she entered the Dark Aether, dormant memories began to surface. Her time as a child in Monty's house, her role in ending the Aether story, her connection to dimensional energies, all of it came flooding back. The Dark Aether recognized her and granted her powers that no human should possess. But this knowledge and power came at a terrible cost. Samantha's psyche was damaged by the Dark Aether's influence, her memories of 2 lifetimes mixing in ways that left her mentally unstable. She could open portals, manipulate reality on a small scale, and sense disturbances in dimensional barriers. But she was no longer fully human, no longer entirely sane. Requiem launched Firebase Z, a rescue operation to extract Samantha from Omega's facility. They were aided by Captain Sergei Ravanov, an Omega scientist who had become disillusioned with his organization's methods and agreed to spy for Requiem. The strike team fought through Vietnam's jungles to Outpost 25, where they found Samantha emerging from the Dark Aether in a state of enhanced power but questionable mental stability. They managed to extract her, but Peck's experiments had already borne fruit. The rift he'd created remained stable, allowing Ethereum to flow freely into our dimension. As 1984 progressed, outbreak zones appeared across the Ural Mountains in Russia. Omega Group was running ahead in the arms race, establishing multiple facilities to harvest Ethereum and develop weapons. Requiem launched Operation Threshold, deploying strike teams into these outbreak zones to gather intelligence and samples. Meanwhile, Richtofen had been conducting secret experiments on Samantha, trying to understand her powers and how they could be weaponized. He kept these experiments hidden from the rest of Requiem's leadership, isolating Maxey's in a secure facility where he tested the limits of her abilities. Richtofen's true identity as the Edward Richtofen from the old timeline, somehow preserved with his memories intact, would not be revealed until much later. He had his own agenda, one that involved capturing the Forsaken for something he called Project Janus. Samantha and Ravanov went behind Requiem's back to conduct their own operation, Operatia Inversia. They discovered that Omega was building reality inversion warheads, nuclear weapons enhanced with Ethereum that could tear massive rifts between dimensions. Samantha and Ravanov destroyed these weapons, but their unsanctioned operation was discovered. Kravchenko, learning that Ravanov was a traitor, set a trap. He orchestrated Operation Excision, where he lured Requiem's strike team into an ambush. The strike team was captured, and Requiem's operations were severely compromised. The captured Requiem team was transported to Berlin, where Valentina had established a massive Dark Aether rift in her attempt to bring the Forsaken into our world. The map Mauerder Toten took place in this divided city, where Requiem operatives were forced to work under Omega's supervision to stop Valentina's plan. Valentina had finally realized she'd been manipulated by the Forsaken, that the promises he'd made were lies designed to use her as a tool. But by the time she understood this, it was too late. The rift was open, and the Forsaken was preparing to cross over. Requiem's strike team, with reluctant assistance from Kravchenko and other Omega personnel, fought through Berlin to Klaus the robot. a defense mechanism Richtofen had left in the city years before. They used Klaus to transport a nuclear warhead into the rift, and the explosion sealed the portal. This display of power confirmed to Richtofen that Samantha was becoming too powerful to control safely. She was a threat to Project Janus if she couldn't be contained. The final confrontation came at a site in western Ukraine. Omega Group, still pursuing their goal of extracting Zykov from the Dark Aether, had built a massive facility around a stable rift. They called the Operation Forsaken, intending to pull the Soviet hero from his prison. What emerged was not the hero Zykov had been. The Forsaken, in his full terrible glory, stepped through the rift with the intention of merging our dimension with the Dark Aether. He commanded legions of zombies and Dark Aether entities, possessing godlike powers that made him nearly invincible. Requiem and Omega forces joined together in desperation. Samantha threw herself into battle against the Forsaken. The two beings, both touched by the Dark Aether, but in fundamentally different ways, clashed with reality-warping force. The strike team managed to activate the Ethereum Neutralizer, a weapon developed to counter Dark Aether energies. Combined with Samantha's powers, they succeeded in trapping the Forsaken in a containment chamber. But Samantha had to sacrifice herself, remaining in the Dark Aether to keep the Forsaken imprisoned. As the rifts closed around the world, she accepted that she would be trapped in that nightmare realm, alone except for the entity she had to contain. Even this sacrifice was part of Richtofen's plan. With Samantha and the Forsaken both secured, he had the components he needed for Project Janus. The director revealed himself to Requiem's leadership, explaining that he had been manipulating events from the beginning. Richtofen's memories of the old timeline had returned gradually over the years. The exact timing of when this occurred isn't entirely clear from available sources, but what we know is that by the time of the Forsaken conflict, he remembered everything. His role in Group 935, his corruption by the MPD, the cycle that had consumed infinite universes. He also remembered the sacrifice that had ended it all, and he had no intention of allowing that sacrifice to be in vain. But he had also seen an opportunity. The Dark Aether was now a prison containing immense power. If that power could be harnessed properly, it could be used to reshape reality, to create a world better than the one that had been destroyed. Richtofen terminated Requiem, ordering the arrest of all senior staff and the strike team. For 6 years, the former Requiem members were held in isolation at a remote facility called Terminus, a former island prison in the Philippine Sea. But Richtofen's plans were more complex than simple betrayal. He was trying to use the Forsaken's power for something specific, resurrecting his wife and son who had died when Samantha Maxis and Gregory Weaver had botched an assassination attempt on him years before. When Richtofen's memories of the old timeline returned and he learned what had happened, it drove him to obsessive lengths to bring his family back. Project Janus was designed to use the Dark Aether's reality-bending properties to resurrect his wife and son. But the project required careful calibration and time. In 1990, William Peck survived the explosion that supposedly killed him and began searching for the imprisoned Requiem members. He located Terminus Island and formulated a plan to break them out, recruiting Maya Aguinaldo to help. This brings us to Black Ops 6 Zombies, set in 1991. The story continues with the escape from Terminus Island and the pursuit of Richtofen through locations like Liberty Falls. The strike team discovers evidence of Richtofen's experiments with the Sentinel artifact, a device capable of channeling Dark Aether energies for reality manipulation. They also encounter SAM, an artificial intelligence that Richtofen had created based on Samantha Maxis' personality and memories. SAM was supposed to help manage Dark Aether energies safely, but the AI developed desires of its own, wanting to exist in physical form rather than as mere code. The conflict between Richtofen, SAM, and the freed Requiem members culminates in a confrontation where the strike team must choose: help Richtofen resurrect his family, or help SAM obtain a physical body. The canonical outcome of this choice has yet to be confirmed, though based on what we know, either path leads to the Sentinel artifact transporting everyone into the Dark Aether. There, in that nightmare dimension, they encounter something shocking, what appears to be new versions of the classic crew. These figures resemble variants of the Primis/Ultimis characters, though their exact nature remains unclear. The current evidence suggests they could be somehow reconstituted from the souls and energies that were banished to the Dark Aether at the end of the Aether story, though this has not been definitively established. Whether these are truly new versions of Dempsey, Takeo, Nikolai, and Richtofen, or merely echoes and remnants of the heroes who sacrificed themselves, is a question that future storylines may answer. What we can infer from their appearance is that the cycle may not be as permanently broken as everyone believed. The Dark Aether has a way of preserving what should be destroyed, of bringing back what should remain dead. And so the Dark Aether saga continues, with new threats emerging from the shadows and old heroes potentially returning to face them. The sacrifices of Primis and Ultimis ensured that Element 115 would never threaten our reality again. But the Dark Aether itself remains, and as long as that dimension exists, there will always be dangers seeping through the cracks between worlds. The wheel continues to turn. The cycle, perhaps, never truly ends. It only changes form, finds new champions, creates new victims. And somewhere in the darkness, ancient forces wait and watch, knowing that corruption always finds new vessels to exploit. The story continues, the fight goes on, and the zombies, in one form or another, will always be rising. Call of Duty Zombies Part 10. Conclusion: the eternal struggle and the stories we tell. The Call of Duty Zombies story is, at its heart, about cycles. The endless repetition of conflict, the recurring patterns of corruption and heroism, the wheel of fate that grinds forward regardless of individual wishes or actions. From the ancient war between keepers and apothecons to the modern struggle against the Dark Aether, the fundamental conflict remains the same. The forces of corruption seeking to consume reality, and the champions who stand against them at terrible cost. What makes this narrative truly remarkable is its willingness to embrace complexity and moral ambiguity in ways that most video game stories avoid. There are no simple villains in this saga. Edward Richtofen, across all his iterations, is simultaneously a monster and a tragic figure. His Ultimis version was a sadistic tyrant who caused unimaginable suffering. Yet his Primis version sacrificed himself to break the cycle. The Dark Aether version tries to resurrect his family using methods that endanger all of reality. Yet his motivations stem from genuine love and devastating loss. Ludwig Maxis's love for his daughter drives him to both heroism and atrocity. In one timeline, he's a dedicated scientist trying to save the world from his colleagues' madness. In another, he becomes so corrupted by the Dark Aether that he destroys Earth and everyone on it just to reunite with Samantha in Agartha. The same motivation, protecting his daughter, leads to completely opposite outcomes depending on which timeline you're examining. Even the Shadow Man, presented as one of the saga's primary antagonists, was once someone's best friend. He was a keeper who shared laughter and wonder with Dr. Monty before corruption twisted him into something unrecognizable. His fall from grace mirrors humanity's own struggles with temptation and the corrupting influence of power. The story asks difficult questions about sacrifice and the cost of victory. Primis and Ultimis gave everything. Their lives, their existence across infinite timelines, their very souls, to save reality from Element 115's corruption. Was it worth it? The new universe they created is free from that particular threat, but it faces dangers from the Dark Aether that may be just as terrible, perhaps worse, because the dimensional barriers have been weakened by all the previous conflicts. Consider the weight of what they accomplished and what they lost. Primis Nikolai had to poison his friends, watch them die, and then ask a young girl to shoot him so the cycle could end. Richtofen had to kill alternate versions of himself, had to manipulate his closest companions, had to die and be replaced so that the mission could continue. Dempsey, Takeo, and Nikolai of both Primis and Ultimis had to accept that their existences would be erased, that they would never see the world they were trying to save. And for what? A universe that doesn't remember them, that has no idea 8 warriors gave everything so that reality could continue. Samantha and Eddie live in the new timeline with no memory of what was sacrificed for them. Humanity goes about its business never knowing how close it came to annihilation. The cycle was broken, but at a cost so steep that it's impossible to say whether it was truly worth it. Victis' fate remains one of the most tragic elements of the entire saga. Samuel Stullinger, Abigail Misty Briarton, Marlton Johnson, and Russman were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They weren't soldiers trained for combat. They weren't scientists who understood Element 115's properties. They were just survivors trying to make it through one more day in a world that had gone insane. They were used and betrayed by forces they barely understood. Richtofen manipulated Stullinger through the voice in his head, exploiting his guilt over being part of the flesh. Maxis presented himself as their savior only to reveal that he'd never cared about their survival. And in the end, they were sacrificed without ever truly understanding why, dying as the multiverse collapsed around them while crying out for answers that never came. Their story serves as a reminder that, in cosmic conflicts, the small people often suffer the most. The gods and monsters play their games across dimensions, but it's always the ordinary humans who pay the price. Victis wanted nothing more than to survive, to find some semblance of safety in a world overrun by zombies. Instead, they became pawns in a game they never asked to play, and their reward for all their suffering was oblivion. The Dark Aether saga demonstrates that even when one cycle ends, another begins. The heroes of this new era, the Requiem Strike team, Samantha Maxey's Reborn, even the antagonist Edward Richtofen with his Project Janus, face challenges that echo the old struggles but require new solutions. The dimensional barriers that were once sealed can be breached. The dark ether that was meant to be a prison has become a source of power and a dwelling place for entities that want nothing more than to consume our reality. Kazimir Zaikov's transformation into the Forsaken shows how even the most heroic sacrifice can be corrupted given enough time and suffering. He sealed the end station rift to save the world, trapping himself in the dark ether for what he thought would be a brief moment. Instead, he spent subjective centuries in that nightmare realm, consuming other beings to survive, gradually losing his humanity until he became the very thing he tried to prevent. The Forsaken's plan to merge our dimension with the dark ether came from a genuinely twisted belief that he was saving the world. In his corrupted mind, forced unity under his rule was better than the conflicts and wars that plagued humanity. He couldn't see that he'd become a tyrant, that his solution was worse than the problems it was meant to solve. It's a cautionary tale about how good intentions can be warped beyond recognition when combined with enough power and isolation. Samantha's sacrifice to contain the Forsaken in the dark ether creates a parallel to her position in the old timeline. Once again, she's trapped in a prison of dimensional energy, holding back forces that would destroy the world if released. But this time, she chose it. This time, she understood what she was doing and why. It doesn't make the sacrifice less tragic, but it gives it meaning in a way her original imprisonment never had. Edward Richtofen's arc across all timelines reveals something fundamental about the nature of redemption and corruption. Ultimis Richtofen was a monster who died unrepentant. Primis Richtofen tried to be better, to make choices that would save reality even at the cost of his own existence. The Dark Aether Richtofen is trying to use terrible methods for an understandable goal, bringing back his murdered family. Which version is the real Richtofen? are they all equally valid representations of what he could be under different circumstances? The story suggests that people are shaped by their experiences and choices, that given different paths, the same person can become hero or villain. It's a more nuanced view of morality than we typically see in gaming narratives. The recurring theme of fathers and daughters runs throughout the entire saga. Maxie's and Samantha's relationship drives many of the most important events across multiple timelines. Richtofen's desire to resurrect his son shows that even the most morally compromised characters can be motivated by genuine love. The Wolf King and his servant Arthur, Monty and his children in the house, even the Shadow Man's twisted relationship with those he manipulates. All of these echo the fundamental human need for connection and the lengths people will go to protect those they care about. Perhaps the ultimate message of the Zombies storyline is that the fight never truly ends. There will always be new threats emerging from the darkness, new champions rising to meet them, new sacrifices required to preserve what we hold dear. The cycle may be broken in one form, but it continues in another, adapted to new circumstances but fundamentally unchanged in its core nature. The dimensional barriers that were sealed after Tagder Toten have been breached again in the Dark Aether saga. The Apothicons may be gone, but the Forsaken and the Old Ones pose threats just as terrible. Element 115 has been banished, but Ethereum serves a similar function in the new timeline. The names change, the specifics shift, but the pattern remains. Corruption seeps through from other dimensions, the dead rise, and heroes must make impossible choices to save a world that will never fully appreciate what was sacrificed for it. And yet, despite the futility suggested by these endless cycles, there's something profoundly meaningful in the struggle itself. Primis and Ultimis knew they were walking toward their deaths, knew the cycle would likely continue in some form even after they were gone. But they made the choice to fight anyway, to sacrifice themselves anyway, because even if they couldn't achieve permanent victory, they could at least give the next generation a chance. The Requiem strike team fights against the Dark Aether outbreaks not because they believe they can permanently solve the problem, but because fighting is better than surrender. Samantha traps herself with the Forsaken not because she thinks it's a permanent solution, but because someone has to hold the line, and she's willing to be that person. This is the heart of the zombie story. The choice to fight even when victory seems impossible, to sacrifice even when the sacrifice might be meaningless, to hope even when hope seems foolish. It's a story about finding meaning in struggle itself, about the bonds forged between people facing impossible odds together, about the small acts of heroism that might not save the world but might save someone, and sometimes that has to be enough. The gameplay itself reinforces these themes. Players fight endless waves of zombies knowing they'll eventually be overwhelmed. The question isn't if they'll fall, but when and how many rounds they can survive before the inevitable comes. Yet players keep fighting, keep trying to reach higher rounds, keep working together to hold back the tide a little longer. The futility is the point. The struggle is what matters. And now, with the appearance of what might be new versions of Primis and Ultimis in the Dark Aether, we're faced with the possibility that the sacrifice at Tagder Toten wasn't as final as it seemed. Whether these are truly the same characters reborn or merely echoes preserved in the Dark Aether remains to be seen. But their presence suggests that the story isn't over, that the cycle continues to turn, that the wheel keeps grinding forward. Perhaps that's as it should be. Stories about ending cycles and achieving final victories are satisfying in their way, but they're also finite. They close doors and answer questions. The zombie story, by leaving things open, by suggesting that the struggle continues, maintains its relevance and power. There will always be more stories to tell, more battles to fight, more sacrifices to make. The Call of Duty Zombies storyline, spanning from Nakdur unto 10 in 2008 to Black Ops 6 in 2024, represents one of gaming's most ambitious narrative experiments. It took a simple concept, survive waves of zombies, and built upon it a mythology that encompasses ancient wars between cosmic entities, time travel across infinite dimensions, moral philosophy about sacrifice and redemption, and deeply personal stories about fathers and daughters, soldiers and duty, corruption and heroism. It's messy and convoluted at times. The timeline fractured so many times that keeping track of which version of which character did what in which dimension requires charts and spreadsheets. But that complexity, that willingness to embrace chaos and contradiction, is part of what makes it compelling. Real myths, real legends are always complicated. They have multiple versions, contradictory details, elements that don't quite fit together. The zombie story feels mythic because it has those qualities. And at the center of it all, regardless of which timeline or dimension you're examining, are people trying to do the right thing in impossible circumstances. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail, sometimes they become the very monsters they were fighting against. But they keep trying, keep fighting, keep hoping that maybe this time they can break the cycle for real. The zombies keep rising, the heroes keep fighting, the cycle keeps turning. And somewhere, in the darkness between dimensions, ancient forces watch and wait, knowing that corruption always finds new vessels, that suffering always finds new victims, that the struggle never truly ends. But neither does hope, neither does courage, neither does the choice to stand and fight when running would be easier. That's the story of Call of Duty Zombies. That's the legacy of Primis and Ultimis and Victis and all who came after. That's what makes it matter even when, especially when, it seems like nothing matters at all. The end. And also the beginning. Epilogue. For the champions who fought across dimensions to tank Dempsey, who never stopped fighting even when he couldn't remember why. To Nikolai Belinsky, who drowned his pain in vodka but never his humanity. To Takeo Masaki, who found honor even in a world without meaning. To Edward Richtofen in all his versions, monster, hero, and everything in between. To Samantha Maxis, who bore burdens no child should carry. To Ludwig Maxis, who tried to save the world and destroy it, sometimes simultaneously. To Misty, Marlton, Stullinger, and Russman, the Victis who deserved better. To the Requiem Strike team, fighting wars they never signed up for. To Kazimir Zykov, who made the hero's sacrifice and paid the tyrant's price. To all who stood against the darkness, who fought the endless waves, who sacrificed everything so that reality could continue. Your story is told. Your sacrifices are remembered. The cycle is broken. The cycle continues. Both are true. Both will always be true. And that, perhaps, is fitting. For the champions who fought across dimensions, from the first knack to the last tag, from Origins to Forsaken, from the ancient Great War to the modern Dark Aether, this story is dedicated to you. Asterisk, you were the first. You were the last. You were Primis and Ultimis and everything between. Asterisk, asterisk, rest now, warriors. Your fight is done. Asterisk, but the story goes on.